Okay. Yes. Good evening. It's now 7 p.m. and I would like to start the meeting of the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'm Councillor Bukok-Nade and I'm the chair of this committee. Before I start the meeting, I would like to welcome to everyone, both in the chamber and those who have joined us remotely. I trust you and families have kept safe during this pandemic. I can imagine the caring and shielding responsibilities which some of us have had during the heights of COVID-19 crisis. I would like to thank our officers and carers for safeguarding our children and teachers who have worked to provide education to vulnerable and key workers' children. This is our first meeting in the municipal year. Please bear with me as I get used to chairing a social distanced meeting. So I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting is being live streamed to the Council's YouTube account and also being recorded for publication on the Council's website. I would also like to remind members and officers to mute their microphone when they're not speaking. Members and officers attending virtually on Microsoft Teams, please use the raise your hand option when you wish to speak. And when they will note this down and will let me know who is wanting to speak. I will give councillors on Microsoft Teams the opportunity to speak at the end of each item. Now, item agenda 1 is apologies for absence. Any apologies for absence?
No, Chair, we've received no apologies.
Thank you, Wendy. So I move now to agenda item 2, which is the minutes. I move that the minutes of the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee held on the 4th of February 2020 to be approved as a correct record. Are there any comments on the accuracy of these minutes? No? Oh, okay. Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just clarify on page 10 of the minutes that 1.2 we resolved 1.2 that ONS considered how they would like to be kept informed of progress relating to the written statement of action to help inform officers for future ONS meetings. It says in the minutes that we did resolve that we wanted that to continue in a written form and that should have been that recommendation should have been updated to reflect that, I believe. But can we just clarify whether that was the case and can that be updated if so? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McDonald. Is that updated? Okay. So, subject to those amendments, the minutes are approved. In terms of any other item 3, any urgent business, I have not agreed to any items of urgent business this evening. So I move swiftly on to item 4, agenda 4. Does anyone have any declarations of interest to make? Linda.
I just need to say that I work for Thurrock Special Needs Services now.
Thank you, that's noted, I believe. Okay. Now, agenda item 5. We're welcoming Councillor James Halding remotely to give us an update. It's going to be a verbal update from the portfolio holder of Children's Services and Adult Care, to this committee. Councillor Halding.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, everyone. Obviously, I was quite honoured when I was asked to rejoin the Cabinet in March and take over leadership for social care. I certainly didn't think at the time that I would spend my first 100-odd days in lockdown, nor, I believe, out of the now 57 meetings I've had with Sheila Murphy and Roger Harris, I think only one has been in person. But if you look at some of the things that we've achieved during lockdown, over 90% of our looked after children reviews being conducted on time. These are quite considerable achievements. That doesn't happen by accident, pandemic. So I just want to place on the record my thanks to the really, really terrific staff we have. I think it's important that as we ease out the lockdown, we continue to put together a very, very ambitious agenda to improve services for looked after children. For example, we've made sure that despite COVID, we've carried on fixing some of the historical problems in foster care pay, giving foster carers a real term funding boost of £350,000, I believe, at the start of this month. Continue to expand Head Start housing so we can support our care leavers into property. I met a series of care leavers virtually last week where they very kindly gave myself and the Cabinet member for housing a tour of their homes. So we're still very keen on moving forward with ambitious plans regardless. But there are two main areas that I want to focus on following this crisis: mobility for looked after children and focusing on vulnerability. So in terms of vulnerability, we know from CQC inspections and Ofsted inspections that Thurrock is a safe borough for the vulnerable, but we can't be complacent. I've requested an independent review of our local safeguarding child partnership to ensure it's really effective in delivering safeguarding, including the timely completion of serious case reviews. That's something I want to talk a little bit more about when I'm in the chamber tomorrow night to deliver my annual portfolio report, and I can certainly give the commitment to Councillor O'Canardi that when we publish the results of that review, both myself and the director will be very happy to meet with her before we go forward to implement any recommendations. We're working closely with the police and an array of groups to better integrate the youth offending service into the wider council system to protect young people from grooming, not just from gangs who prey on the vulnerable, but also as we go into an economic downturn, it's clear that some young people become more vulnerable because of a loss of opportunity, and that in turn will lead to possible gang activity preying upon them. And I'm very pleased that Councillor Holloway, who chairs the Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee and is my shadow portfolio holder for health and adults, has joined my Economic Vulnerability Task Force. And I'm also happy to extend an invite to Councillor Canardi this evening. Secondly, looking to mobility, we are a good rated service now, and I'm keen that we truck on and focus on becoming outstanding. That's why we're going to be rolling out a new strategy to help deal with transition. We know that transition doesn't work as well as it should between adolescence and adulthood. A great example of that is the mental health system. Transition does not work the way it is meant to. So we're going to be starting off at the end of this month with refreshing the health and wellbeing strategy. And the first strand of that is going to be a deep dive on mental health. There are lots of ways we can evolve from the COVID crisis and what we've learned. And the beginning of the refresh of the health and wellbeing strategy is a core part of that. One of the things that I tackled in a previous life when I was the Cabinet Member for Health is the issue of wide integration across the care partnership, across the other authorities and the hospitals in South Essex. Now, we're working hard with them, so we pool resources where it makes sense, like cancer care pathways, but at the same time, we need to protect our local autonomy here in Thurrock. So, for example, when we're preparing certain health interventions for young people, looked after children, SEND plans, it's vital we have that health input. And I'm very pleased that so far, the bones of the infrastructure of our clinical commissioning group, we have been reassured we are going to keep a great deal of autonomy here, And actually the phrase that our partners have now put into black and white, thanks to the brilliant work of our Director of Public Health, Ian Wake, is that place will be the primary planning area, i.e. the presumption will be to push powers down to Thurrock, not to shushoon them up. And that's vital when it makes sure that the voice of young people and the voice of children is very, very firmly embedded in the NHS network. And finally, I want to work with fostering, adoption, and other partners to consider our performance. Yeah, we've got some terrific figures coming out of the crisis. 90.5% of looked after children visits being completed on time. That's fantastic. But there are equally some figures that cause me concern as the cabinet member. 58% of pathway plans being completed. Now, 58% certainly is not what I or any of my team aspire to. So I want to have that open conversation and have a frank discussion about the areas that we think we need to improve in. So those are some of the things that we want to do to make sure that our service is assisting young people in reaching the ambitions that they want to achieve, and not simply just about processing a formal system for looked after children. We want it to be more than that. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of what it is I've been up to. Obviously, members are going to have another crack at me tomorrow night in the chamber during question time, and I look forward to what I've been told is going to be about a 5-hour full council very eagerly, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions here. But other than that, Chair, thank you very much for allowing me to say a few words this evening. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Councillor Alden. And I will take your offer of supporting you in your work. I wanted to ask a question, but you did say you just first 100 days into the job. So, but I'm still going to ask it anyway, and then you may decide to, respond some other time. I believe that from the report that you have been chairing a development board, and I just wanted to find out how would you be measuring the effectiveness of that board?
Well, thank you, Councillor Granardi. It's a very good question. So the reason I said I wanted to publicly have that conversation with adoption, fostering and other bodies is to consider the targets we hold to ourselves and consider what we want those targets to be. So when I was a portfolio holder for education previously, we went through an exercise where we looked at what are our targets for NEETs, young people not in education, training or employment. And then we looked at what we wanted that target to evolve into, the stretch target, putting more pressure on ourselves. So for me, the way I'll judge the effectiveness of the development board is when we have that conversation with partners about the targets that we're currently hitting and the stretch target by ourselves. What do we want to hit in the future? But ultimately, a lot of things that I'm going to be judging success of for the time being will be the work of the Economic Vulnerability Task Force that I'm chairing, heading into a COVID-based recession, making sure that we protect young people and protect young adults and their interests and livelihoods is going to be my main focus. And certainly with yourself and Councillor Holloway sat on that board, I'm quite confident you'll robustly hold me to account.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Alden. I'm now going to open this to questions or comments for the portfolio holder. Councillor Akebon.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to ask the portfolio holder that now that we are facing a very difficult time and many young people are simply not getting a job, what are you what can you do to help young people during this difficult time?
Well, thank you, Councillor Ackenbone, for your question. So there are three things that worry me about young people in this difficult time: employment, housing, and keeping them safe. So one of the core things that the Economic Vulnerability Task Force is doing is coordinating the advice that's going out, but also reaching out to young people and asking them about the usefulness of that advice. So when Aspire, our career service, is offering advice, is that useful to you? When Head Start Housing is reaching out to you, did we reach out to you promptly enough? When mental health services are perhaps called upon by you, are you getting a timely referral? So that's the first focus for me, making sure that the advice and support we're offering is valued by young people, and if it isn't, what do we need to do to change it to make sure that young people can actually get the benefit of it, works for them. And I think going forward, there's going to be a lot we need to do in terms of the apprenticeship levy, monies that are levied by public and private bodies to pay for the cost of training in an apprenticeship. We know apprenticeships are quite difficult during a recession, and we know overwhelmingly care leavers and certain adults do access apprenticeships. So we need to focus very clearly on what a post-COVID apprenticeship plan looks like, and we've started working on that. Continuing to expand Head Start Housing is a scheme I believe in, and for more young people, we need to make sure those resources are available. So those are kind of the focuses, Councillor Ackenbone, and certainly if committee would like a formal report at some stage from the Economic Vulnerability Group, I'd be more than happy to bring that forward after the summer.
Councillor McDermott.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Holden, for your report. Can I just ask, maybe this doesn't fall within the, I'm sure you'll let me know if this doesn't fall within the remit that we're looking at here, but are there any funds coming down the line to support some of this work? Because obviously young people already quite disadvantaged, disproportionately affected by other things that have been happening economically and have got higher rates of unemployment than other age groups within the population. Is there any news of any extra funding coming to actually support our young people who look likely to be disproportionately affected by COVID, especially economically and in terms of job opportunities moving forward? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Muldowney. Very good question. We have already received funds for a number of things. So, for example, you would have seen my slightly overgrown visage last week when we took delivery of 600 laptops for looked after children and so on and so forth to be distributed across the borough for young people who didn't otherwise have access. So those 600 were paid for with central government resources, including some top-up work we're doing for young people whose homes are not Wi-Fi enabled. There are other pots of money that I'm sure you understand at the moment that are still geared towards the actual infection control. So, for example, we've just received just over £1 million for our local outbreak board to monitor and counter any possible rises of the infection rate. But as you know, funding for young people and looked after children is something we've always maintained. We maintained a full career service with Aspire, the career hub in Grays. Their work with NEETs, young people not in education, training or employment, their work with looked after children, that's funding that we've always protected. That's funding that we're going to maintain. And obviously, we're going to have extremely difficult days ahead. With a 14% contraction in the economy, COVID has resulted in about £9 million of extra pressures on the council this year alone. There will be difficult days ahead. But that's really why I want to highlight schemes like Head Start Housing. Head Start Housing isn't just good because it helps put a roof above the head of a care leaver. Head Start Housing is great because it actually saves the council money, because we're not paying for some of these very expensive out-of-borough placements. And it also is good for the young person because it allows us to further wrap them in pastoral support in terms of employment and education advice. So, yes, there is some money coming down from central government. Yes, we have quite a robust system already in place that we're going to protect. But certainly going forward, the economic outlook is going to be pretty tough. And that's why we do need to look at spend-save schemes like Head Start Housing. I think my hand has gone back up, so I will silence myself.
Thank you, Councillor Howden, for your answer and for your reassurance that you're going to fight hard to protect these essential services for our young people. That's very reassuring to hear. Thank you.
Is there any further questions for Councillor Halding? No? Thank you very much, Councillor Halding, for being here. Obviously, you're welcome to stay on, but if you have to leave, it's fine. Thank you.
I'll stay for a while. You may lose me at some stage to babysitting duties.
So the next item is the agenda item 6, and that is the Youth Cabinet update. Can I ask the Youth Cabinet who have joined us tonight remotely to give an update? Thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Adam Shea. I am the Vice Chair of the Youth Cabinet. I'm going to just open up and go over what we kind of started before lockdown. So initially, Patrick Kilty, who was previously running the Youth Cabinet, he left and moved on to, gosh, I can't remember now, but has been replaced by Roberta, who's really good so far. Then we had elections, the results being I'm Vice Chair. I've just got feedback that Patrick Kilty moved on to Essex and Colchester. Lucia, who's also here, moved on, or is the chair, and Alicia is the member of Youth Parliament. So this all happened relatively quickly, but just before lockdown, and now we can't meet in the cabinets, again, lockdown, so we use Google Meets, and we all meet up together to talk about what we're going to do in the future. And I think Lucia will talk about some of that now.
Hello, yes, so I'm Lucia Lucioni and I'm the Chair of Thurrock Youth Cabinet. So during our virtual meeting, we've had a guest speaker come on based around youth employment. We have also been talking about trying to capture the voices of the special educational needs and disability people. I think that's quite important, especially in our borough. And we are particularly focusing during our virtual meeting with youth employment. So we had a guy come in and talk to us about it, ask some questions on what we think and what we feel can be improved because of our ageing generation. During the times that are in the moment, it's quite hard to find a job, especially for our future. And we've also been trying to just improve people's experience with the youth cabinet and the virtual meetings. And we've just been trying to get to grips with it all at the moment. And our next thing will be passed over to Alicia.
So something I've been working on besides like off the youth cabinet, but I'd really like to mention it anyway. Some of you might not be aware, but young people currently they couldn't submit any questions towards the press briefings. So they couldn't submit their views or questions, and they couldn't have anything answered by government. So basically the youth voice has been ignored, and I think especially that in Thurrock, we should be listening to our young people because they are the next generation of people to work in Thurrock. And I don't know what we can do as Overview and Scrutiny, but I think we should definitely have something where we can try and get young people's questions answered. And I know Councillor Howden said that he's been speaking to young people, which is really good to hear. But it's not enough. I feel like there's so much that has been lost through the youth where they've just not been able to voice their opinions. I think we need to do more. So yeah.
We're open to questions if anyone has any.
No. Okay, thank you very much. Was that Roberta that was speaking lastly?
Alicia?
Okay, sorry, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up about the youth voice being ignored. I am glad that Councillor Alden is still here, and I'm sure he's listening. And we will make sure youth voice is not ignored, and because you're valuable, you contribute invaluably to the council on its own generally. So we will make sure that that doesn't happen. And firstly, I also like to congratulate you on retaining your positions after the election. And thank you for joining us tonight. And I really, really appreciate your continued commitment. So if anybody has any question or comment, can they say to the Youth Cabinet? Councillor McDowning.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Youth Cabinet. It's always great to hear what's happening in the Youth Cabinet. Obviously, we're living through unprecedented times at the moment, but I'm glad that you've managed to get the elections done. I think it's a really good point that you make about making sure that your voice is heard. I mean, I think that youth issues in general tend to slip off the political agenda, both at national level, and we mustn't let that happen. We mustn't let that happen at local level, and we should be supporting you to make your voice heard at national level as well. You say that you're having Zoom meetings during this period of time. I mean, do you ever have members come and join you on that, either to listen in or to take part in those meetings? And would you be open to having that kind of input? Thank you.
As in council members, sorry?
Yes, by members, I mean councillors, yeah.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't have any problems with that. We'd have to organise that with Roberta at the moment, as she does everything to do with Google Meets. Although I'm happy to send off an email about that and get back to you if you want. Is there any way I can contact you after?
I am on the call. Sorry.
Hello.
Yeah, if you do want to meet with the youth cabinets and join one of our meetings, that will be absolutely fine.
Great. Should I email you or?
Yeah, I can either find your email or you can email me directly. I can speak to Wendy Lee, whatever would be easier for you.
Either of those two options, so
I'll make it happen.
Okay.
Thank you,
Roberta. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If there's no other comments, okay, Councillor Akubon.
Thank you, Chair. Well done, Youth Cabinet, and thank you for coming today. Just quick question, because when you mentioned that you are not being listened to, it broke my heart. And I'm thinking, have you been able to hold a meeting with the Cabinet holder, with Councillor Hilden, to tell him what your concerns are?
No, we haven't actually been able to speak to anyone really within the council over this sort of period, but we'd definitely be open to it, especially because I know me, Lucia and Adam have definitely got some pressing questions, and I can imagine there's a lot more other youth cabinet members and young people at Thurrock who have got pressing questions as well. So, but thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Okay, then, Councillor Harding.
Just to briefly say, Chair, I'm always happy to talk to any group. I've just had a brief text exchange with my director, who's going to make sure an invite to meet with me goes out very shortly. Certainly during lockdown, I've met with 9 or so care leavers in council accommodation. I've done an online quiz with a group of children in care. My director did not do as well as I did. And also, I would like to think I'm relatively in touch with the youth of the borough. I may turn 30 next week, but I'm still technically in my 20s. So I'm relatively in touch. But certainly if anyone ever wants to talk to me, I'm always more than happy to do so.
I think a meeting with Councillor Holden would be really, really helpful and beneficial to the Cabinet. I think that'd be something that should definitely be arranged.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Youth Cabinet, for joining us tonight. As I would say, you are allowed to stay on, but if you have to leave, you are also allowed. Thank you very much. So I move now to the agenda item 7, and that is the safeguarding children during COVID. It's a report you find on page 15 to 20. And can I ask Joe Tynan to introduce this report, please?
Thank you, Chair. The purpose of the report is really to reassure the committee of the work that's been done to safeguard children during COVID. I think we talk about COVID if it's over, but it's still continuing. So we're constantly adjusting to the changes and actually to make sure that we're actually safeguarding children. My intention is not to go through the whole body of the report, but I think what it does is it clearly outlines since the start of COVID-19 what we've done in response to that in respect to procedures, policies and practice, and how we've tested to make sure that we are safeguarding children. If I sort of take you to the aspect initially of the guidance we completed was around doing risk assessments on all open children in children's social care and early help and our youth offending service as well. And that's where all them risk assessments done to identify what level of contact would be appropriate for them individual children. Obviously, there's a balance here in respect to supporting children and families and also our staff as well, during the early stages of the pandemic. So that was the balancing act. I think we have actually continued to respond to safeguarding issues appropriately and swiftly and appropriately to those. I think what you see in the report is how we tested that. And what we've seen is the quality assurance that we put in was to look at the cases that were rated red. How did we know? We went reviewed and had a look at them, and we did a sample of at least 100 cases, which is connected to 100 children per month to make sure we were getting them decisions right, and regarding the reds, the ambers and the greens as well. So, and I think from that aspect, we've adjusted to that. We've made sure that we've connected with young people virtually and physically, the term is, face to face, but we've been quite creative in the way that we did that in the early sort of stages, making sure we were video linking with families and young people. But in certain situations, you still need to see children face to face. You do need to go into homes. You do need to have them conversations. And I think for us, it was a balance of getting that right. And I think we have done that. And I think we were cautious at the beginning, but we have moved more to face-to-face visits as the weeks have gone on, and based upon government advice as well in response to that. And we've made sure we've had a strong link up between children's social care and education. I've personally taken place in a number of meetings with schools to share information around particular children that we may be concerned about, because during COVID, lots of children haven't been in school, and that's a missing link for us. And we've seen that in the referrals that we've come in. So we've needed to actually make sure we communicate more effectively with the schools, share information. We put in communication channels between education and social care to make sure there wasn't any duplication. If there was a concern or worry about a particular child, there was a single point of access to make sure we could do that. We could follow up with the schools as well and make sure that we're getting that information right and sharing that concerns, and to state the obvious, that we don't miss anything. And I think that was the key. So as a process has gone on, we've constantly been moving and changing our approach, because the guidance has been changing as we've sort of been moving through COVID. At the current stage, over 74% of our children in June across the board were seen face to face, which I think is a good good number of them face-to-face contacts, which has been positive. But where it's been assessed that needs to be direct contact, there is always direct contact. When you get an immediate safeguarding concern, you do need to go out, you do need to see people, you do need to have conversations with children and assess that level of risk at that initial point. So, I mean, I think from that aspect, the guidance has been recently updated in June to, as I say, to move more towards face-to-face visits, but we have been very cautious with the safety of staff and make sure staff have had PPE and consider our workers that are shielding, that have underlying health conditions. I think where we've really been fortunate in Thurrock is we've seen a high percentage of our staff still being able to do their job creatively. Lots of people are working from home. We have a limited number in our offices, but it just shows you agile working. We have been able to continue to safeguard, support families during this difficult time. So I just wanted to give a brief sort of overview, but I would just want to add this little aspect in. Today I had the opportunity to join a group with 3 young people who are currently in foster care, and I asked them the questions. I said to them, how has COVID been for you? Do you feel as if you've had the appropriate level of support from your social workers? What would you want me to take back? What's the learning from this? And the feedback from them was so positive. It was absolutely lovely to hear about the experiences. One said, well, I just ring them up. Whenever I want to speak to my social worker or text, I ring them up. Do you feel you've had enough support? Yes. Do you feel you connected with your social workers? Yes, we have. And it was like, it was so positive, and it was just so lovely to see the young people and hear their experiences. And also, during lockdown, they've actually assisted us with our interviews for our newly qualified social workers. And I was saying, how did you find that? And they were just saying it was really a joy to be involved in that recruitment and selection process. So where in certain instances with COVID, there's been restrictions, but again, it's been looking to be creative. How do we continue to reach out to our children, stay connected, provide them with a voice and a vehicle to share any concerns and make sure that we respond to them, as we would have done pre-COVID, because at the end of the day, safeguarding needs to be done. Children need to be safeguarded and supported, and where we have seen a little bit of differences around our children with our additional needs, because around the structure of schools, that's impacted on some of our children. So we've made sure we put some additional support in there for those children and been a bit more creative about this support. What does it go in your community, go in the house, but you having to work with families to gain that relationship, because in certain situations that people would prefer their children at home because they're safe, and that worry, that concern has been there throughout COVID, and we've had to respect that, and we had to try and work in partnership with lots of families to make sure we are getting the information, we are assessing people, we are visiting people, and we're in a position to feel confident we're supporting them. But as I say, the percentage of direct face-to-face visits is going up week on week now. We have been providing regular returns to DFE as well about how often we're seeing our children, what have our referral rates been through our MASH. So we've been tracking all of that, and because it's a changing position you're working, you're checking that and reviewing that on a daily basis or ever of a daily basis to make sure, and we've been creative in how we've been linking around domestic abuse, making sure we're going into supermarkets, we're reaching out to families and realising at the point when only one person was going into the supermarket, it was a good opportunity to do things. And what we've realised, you can do things differently. And I often say to my workers is, you can get to the same destination, but the way that you travel there is slightly different during COVID.
Yes, thank you very much, Gerald, for these reports and the updates, and particularly for the anecdotal information that you gave, like you interview some children. I was going to ask you that question, but you almost answered it, but I'll just extend it a bit. I mean, the question I was going to ask you was that, were there any challenges that you experienced, obviously, apart from the normal challenge? I mean, you've done very well, we must commend you. So any other experience or challenges that you've experienced? And I was going to mention the fact that sharing data or information remotely with agencies, particularly example of school, regarding vulnerable children that were not attending school as they're supposed to be. And you did say that you said something about that, but how did you tackle that problem in terms of children that are vulnerable and are not attending school? How did you ensure that it's safeguarded during that time? Thank you.
I think it was about being very creative. In lots of instances, we've had lots of our social workers go out to families and deliver food parcels, to go and speak to children through windows in the early stages, going out seeing in the garden, going to the park with them. Again, it's about being creative. It's about looking at the information from our education colleagues. What we were doing is to make sure we were sharing that information together and making the best case decision based upon that concern. And sometimes the challenge is when you have information that is of concern, but parents maybe might not want you to go and visit for a particular reason. So you look at all the options and you turn around and say, well, does anybody in the household have any symptoms at the moment? And we're willing to make sure we're wearing protective clothing to see where we feel it's absolutely necessary that we do see children, because we feel that there may be potential for them to be at immediate risk of harm. And that's where we've had to be very clear and prescriptive on those individual cases. But on the whole, families have worked in partnership with us, and I think through regular communication. And what I did in the early stages was where our statutory duty around our children that are subject to child and need plans require support and advice. The statutory duty is that we would make contact with them every 20 working days. What we did is we increased that contact to make sure we were having contact with particular children and families on a weekly or a fortnightly basis to make sure we had that concern. So where we were unable to reach families, we would go and still do unannounced visits to make contact where we hadn't seen children or they weren't on the phone. And a strange thing is that through the challenges of trying to reach out to particular children, some of the pluses and benefits were our teenagers were more engaged because they're very much into their technology, and they would actually communicate more and share information with us in a different way, in a technical way. So I think although there's been challenges, there's definitely been some wins and some advantages of looking at this way. And I think reflecting on some of that, what we're looking at is going forward about what we will do in our recovery and what aspects can we use going forward in respect to some of the ways that we've worked during COVID. And I think them are some of the things we're doing at the moment, and we're busy looking at a recovery plan in the Eastern region, which we're doing to be completed by later this month. And that's where all the local authorities in the Eastern region are sharing their ideas and what does their recovery plan look like post-COVID or during the different stages as COVID changes. And I think we need to be realistic, is that we're working in a very difficult situation that may change week on week. We see particular areas that may be shut down, closed down because of the epidemic, and the numbers are increasing. So we're ready for that. If we need to take a step back within COVID, like we did at the beginning of the process, we're ready to that. And I'd say what we're doing is clearly linking in with our partner agencies. We're monitoring our referrals into the MASH quite closely. We've done some communication now, which Councillor Holden has led on some of that communication to make sure the word is out in the community. People know the referral route to come in and to get support for young people if they're worried or concerned. And like anything else, what we know is potentially when the school's back in September, we will see an influx. We've got some strategies in place to manage that particular situation if we do see an increase in numbers, especially around domestic abuse or mental health. So that's something, again, that's part of our plan we're looking at as well.
Thank you very much, Joe. That is a very detailed response. Thank you. I'll call Councillor Anderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for introducing the report, Joe. You made brief mention of it in your comments just there, and that's the multi-agency safeguarding hub. Now, as a committee, we were invited to have a look at the MASH, I think it was early last year, and I recall it was quite an enclosed part of the office. And so I was wondering, with the restrictions on social distancing, has the MASH been operating at the same capacity as it was pre-COVID?
Yes, it just only seems 2 minutes since you came to the MASH. I remember quite clearly. Yes, we're functioning exactly the same way, but in a creative way and an agile way. So we have limited number of people physically in the building, in the building of the MASH, but we've set up the technology so they can still continue to do their job exactly as they were sitting in the office. When the phone rings, it picks up at the same. Our screening clerks respond in the way. Our practice managers that make decisions and liaise with partners make the decisions on threshold, they continue to do that as normal. And I think because the numbers of referrals have reduced, that they weren't under pressure in that sort of sense, we are starting to see the numbers increase in the MASH, but they're not back to where they were pre-COVID at this moment in time, but they are definitely stepping in to the right direction. What some of the trends we're seeing around that is about, we're not seeing as many no further actions. So when we get referrals and we say it doesn't meet the threshold, we're not really seeing them cases coming through. We're seeing more cases that are in need. We are seeing a good level of complexity in them cases that do need that immediate safeguarding response as well. So that's the sort of trend change we are seeing, but we are sort of monitoring that quite closely.
Thank you. Is there any Councillor Akebon?
Thank you for the report and the update. One quick question, because you briefly mentioned domestic abuse. I just want to know if there is increase in domestic abuse during this difficult time, or are we safe? Are they safe? Are the children doing okay? Is there same report that we have last year, or do we have more this year? That's what I just want to know. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think we're not really seeing an increase. What we're doing is every week we're tracking our high, medium and standard domestic abuse referrals into children's social care. So we haven't seen an increase, but we're sort of predicting that we may see an increase in September, because I think the longer COVID goes on, the restrictions are in place. It places different challenges on families that weren't there pre-COVID. So we are expecting an increase. We're busy looking at a paper thinking, if we need additional resource to make sure that is in place for that time. But we're tracking that, as I say, on a weekly basis with the police, with the MASH, and we do have a team manager who's dedicated around domestic abuse in children's social care, and he's providing advice and has linked in where appropriate on particular cases where intervention or support is required. So at this moment in time, it isn't causing a difficulty, but we're planning for a potential increase in the months to come.
Councillor McDonough.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Joe, for this report. It's been very interesting to hear not only the processes that you've put in place during COVID to manage this important area, but also about the innovations and the unexpected benefits sometimes of working under lockdown. So thank you for that. The examples that you've given have given me a real flavour of how the service has been during lockdown. I just had more of a clarifying question about the risk assessments. So obviously you RAG rated the risk assessments, and I think I probably, from some of the detail you gave, would know that possibly children who aren't attending school would be in a higher risk category than children who were attending school, for example. But could you give us an idea about what would distinguish those categories from each other? So how would what characteristics would distinguish some child in a risk rating, an amber risk rating, as opposed to a green one, for example?
Thank you. As part of the risk assessment, we sort of created that to consider each child's individual needs and what the risks associated to that were. So in essence, an obvious correlation is looking at children that are subject to a child protection plan. That's where there is imminent risk. That is why they've met the threshold for a child protection plan. So children that are subject to a child protection plan would be automatically be rated as a red case that needed direct face-to-face. Where there were particular concerns, it may be the fact is that you had a cumulative concern around neglect or family dysfunction, that also would meet the criteria where it would require a direct visit. And what we did as well around it is the frequency of the visit. So it wasn't just a seeing is what would be a direct visit, what would be an amber visit. It would also be what was a cumulative effect, what were the concerns. So if there was domestic abuse in that household, if the child was failing to thrive, there was an issues around engagement, them are the ones that you would say, what we do is we need to be into these homes to see these particular children. Where there's more of a settled plan, and it's working that plan, that wouldn't be as high risk. But what I've always said is that I'd need convincing why we wouldn't need to visit rather than the opposite. I think that's where I was coming from in our visits, because I think to myself is that when we're looking at risk, it's all about what don't we know, and at the stages when you have limited family members involved, when you have limited professionals, then you think there's more risk, there's more concern. So when you're looking at that cumulative effect, often it could be around a variety of variables. As I said before, when you look at them in isolation, you might not think, well, that's not a concern. There was previous domestic abuse, but we haven't had any reports for three months. But is a child going to school? Is a child displaying any challenging behaviour? Then you've got the counteract to that aspect when you're working with your children with additional needs, where there's significant health-related concerns where it isn't appropriate or acceptable for you to do a direct visit, but there is a level of concern where you'd be having more telephone contact, you'd be having video links with particular families, because when you're looking at the more complex needs where there's health, where you think the child would be infected and that would place them under greater risk. So that's where some of the balancing act that we've done as professionals. But what we've also done is by having the quality assurance team looking at them as managers, we've looked at independent cases to look at, if you like, you're looking at cold, you're thinking, right, these are the concerns, this is the impact, this is what's been put forward. Do we agree with that? So that has to be signed off by a team manager as well, and that's being reviewed by senior managers as well. And the feedback on those cases they were appropriately rated based on risk and the plan. But like anything else, there was always opportunity to reflect and share learning when we've looked at particular cases. So the fresh pair of eyes gives a different perspective, gives a different lens, and I think that's why it's been really productive to look at that. And people that aren't actively managing them particular children to thinking, have we got this one right? And the reality is, you may make a decision that it's amber or red on a particular day, but there may be a circumstances or additional information that comes in that makes you change your response in respect to that. So where we started off at the beginning of COVID to where we are now, as I say, we've seen a massive impact on making sure we are seeing children face to face, and now we're getting to the point where we're seeing is if a child isn't being seen face to face, then you need to do a risk assessment to justify why that isn't happening, and that needs to be signed off and authorised by a strategic lead. So there has been a change of focus in respect from the start of the process to where we are now.
Thank you for the response. Is there any further question? No? No. Thank you very much. You have a question, yes? Thank you.
You already answered one about the increase of disclosures that we're expecting in September. But one other aspect I'm quite concerned about is the children that are not suspected as being at risk. They're under the radar, but they've probably spent a long time over the period of COVID not being at school with online gaming, and within that the radicalisation that can occur. How do you feel that we could maybe educate the parents or bring their awareness that their children are probably online gaming a lot more than they normally are, and they might start to, where they're not at school, maybe being influenced and starting to have views or opinions that are, where they're being radicalised, which is going under the radar at the moment because no one at school is picking up on the change of their language or their behaviour.
It's a very good question. I think it's in the sense of it's trying to work where that information becomes available. That's when you're having them discussions with parents, and I think that's when going back to the conversation I said earlier on about education. So it's really about because the teachers know the children best and knows is a change, and what's really positive is that schools have been having regular contact with these children as well, and we've been having regular contact. And I think where we've seen any concerns, what we've done is look to try and work with the school to actually have the children return to school, because obviously they're being supported by a social worker, and if there's any concerns in respect to that. Sometimes it's general advice you're giving, so if you're looking at that. But to go up to the point about the children that are sitting under the radar a little bit is, I think them are the ones often that are most at risk, because when you look at the serious case reviews, you see them sort of child in need cases or early offer. So what we've done is we've been very clear about where we stand on these cases to make sure the children, even perceived to be at lower level of early offer, them are direct visits, them are increasing as well. Our child in need cases, we're having child in need meetings, we're doing lots of this virtually again, and we're acting. If we become aware of any particular concerns, we are acting on that. But I think it really is coming back to us working in partnership collectively together with parents, with all the professionals, with school, and if we become aware of that collectively, assessing that level of risk and looking at what is the intervention. Because what we've actually seen is because of when we had the lockdown, we've seen less people on the street, we've seen less antisocial behaviour, we've seen lots of different aspects where people at home, and there's always the balancing act about what you see, where you see a positive in one area, you may see a negative in another. And I think that's why it's been key to have the video links into people's homes as well, because basically when you're having them conversations, parents are around, sometimes the young people are walking around the house, you're getting a sense of them. And we've seen some examples where people have challenged, there have been challenges around their behaviour, and we've had to work with parents to try and find a solution to help them manage. As we've seen a bit more of an increase around within our children with additional needs. Some of them challenging behaviours have increased, but we've looked to provide creative support, having people going out on weekends, providing that. But I think it's an ongoing situation where you're providing that advice to try and support families, because lots of families ring up and say, I'm really, really concerned, we've noticed this and that. And as soon as we become aware of it, we can support the family and we can work as a collective multi-agency group to look at what is the best intervention. It's not like, and we haven't seen an increase in our child protection numbers during COVID in respect to that. And that's a national picture. Nobody has generally seen that. What we've just looked is to make sure we're reaching out to people, we're talking to parents, we're aware of concerns, and making sure we're connecting with the young people. We're not just ringing up the parents and having a conversation with them. I think it's really important. I think what's really rich is when our social workers have really positive relationships with young people, and they're saying, these are my struggles, these are my challenges around maybe emotional well-being. Then some people are taking them out for walks, having conversations. So it's about trying to be creative. But when you are aware of a concern, it's about making sure that we are seeing children. We are at the end of the phone, a bit like the example I mentioned before in the virtual discussion was when the young people saying, I know I can ring my social worker and I can text them and I have that. And I think for them that gives them, some young people, a level of reassurance, because I think the balance is about how productive the conversations are, what the level of concern is and what the plan is. Because I think what we're very keen to do is continue to support families during this time. And again, we've had to be, I've used the word quite a lot tonight about creative, flexible, and finding solutions in different ways. And I think by having that level of relationship with the social worker, with the teacher, with particular professionals, that is our, if you like, our safety net in respect to seeing if any concerns are raised. And it may be the situation there was a conversation with a teacher, and I think, well, that's really unusual for little Johnny to say that. So, and again, that's where that communication has been really, really important. And one of the things I would really like to take forward from COVID is what I'd say is a really positive relationship I've had since I've been in post with education and with the head teachers been, really, really positive. It's been solution focused, trying to find the right support for young people. And I think that's something I'll remember during this period as really positive.
Thank you very much, Joe. I see you give a very detailed response all the time. We really need to now move on to agreeing the recommendation on page 15. Are all members in agreement to that recommendation? Page 15, 1.1. Agreed. Thank you very much. Swiftly moving on to agenda item 8. Can I ask Michelle Lucas to give us an update on the education aspect of your work during COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. I think what really resonates is picking up on what Joe said about this partnership approach to how we've dealt with what is, as we say, a global pandemic. I think I'd like to put on record, actually, Chair, if I may, schools have worked tirelessly. They have worked tirelessly. Please feed that back if you're working in schools. I've seen that. Both the director and myself meet with a range of CEOs and other infrastructure chairs on a weekly basis, and we're continually having that dialogue. I think what's really important is that if we think about this, the government's drive initially was around the vulnerable children and key worker children. Clearly, right from early years, right the way up to our post-16, everybody has provided what they can to support those children and those young people. And I think that's really, really positive. I think some of the key things for me, Chair, if I may, and again, it comes back to this partnership working. Clearly, our strong partnership with our colleagues in public health has meant that we've been able to quite quickly contact our colleagues in public health is that if there has been an issue in schools and what we need to do about it. Because, you know, initially with everything being locked down, then it was key workers and vulnerable children. How could we make that work? And I think picking up, there's been a lot of talk about safeguarding. And just to reassure committee that schools are also contacting their young people, their children, on a very regular basis. They are in contact with these children. And I think what Joe discussed was the fact that actually what they've been able to do, if they feel there is an escalation, they've been able to feed that directly in. And members of our colleagues in social care have dealt with that and dealt with that really quickly. So I think that gives committee reassurance in relation to that. So really well done to all of our schools. Clearly it's been really challenging trying to think about social distancing, particularly when things changed for schools whereby more children were encouraged to return. Thinking about how they can make that work has been very creative, I have to say. Lots of really creative ideas around that. I think one of the things that sort of struck me around all of this is that collegiate way of working. You know, how can we make this work? It wasn't, you know, well, we can't do it. It was, well, actually we can, but we need to do it in this way. And that's coupled with, you know, schools that had a number of staff, Chair, who were shielding, who weren't able to come in. They quickly adapted. They've got an online offer now. So, you know, to mobilise colleagues with an online offer, as well as dealing with bringing in key worker children, vulnerable children, absolutely the right thing to do, I think gives evidence around how they've worked to ensure that our children and young people are getting the best sort of that they can at this particular point in time. If I may, Chair, I'm very conscious of time, but if I may, I think the challenges will be for September. So we're coming to the end of this academic year. Some schools will be doing some work over the summer, but that's what they would normally have done, colleagues. It's not in addition, it's what they would have normally done. So I think the challenge will come in September and seeing how that works. We're already seeing some local lockdowns across the country, what that will look like for Thurrock. As I said, clearly the partnership arrangements we've got with public health means that we can link into that really, really quickly. So I think it will be, we will need to wait and see what September brings, but all staff, I'll reiterate, all staff have worked really hard to ensure that, you know, children and young people, you know, get the best opportunities that they can. And I think, again, Chair, the area I'll pick out a little bit, if I may, is early years, because sometimes that can get a little bit forgotten. And actually early years is critical. You know, those early years are really, really important. And I'm pleased to say that because the local authority has some of its own nursery provision, we were able to step in when some of the private providers, for all the right reasons, decided they needed to remove their provision, they needed to go and take the offer of the furlough. We were able to support those children in our own settings. So, you know, that's a real positive. It's a real strength for Thurrock, actually. And talking to regional colleagues, which I do very often, I have to say, more often than I used to, colleagues, what I would say is that actually that is one of the uniquenesses of Thurrock, that we can pick up that and we can move with that really, really quickly. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Councillor Smith.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it's in your remit, but I'm just wondering, is there any extra finances available to the schools for everything that they've been able to put in place for COVID? I know, for example, every area has to have a lidded bin, and I've heard of, like, it's cost some schools £700 and that's come out of their English budget, and so I just wondered if that was going to be topped up in any way.
Okay, thank you. All schools are costing things COVID related into a cost centre that's got COVID related. We're waiting for further guidance on that. Government have been sending money through to support different areas. So again, fantastic news that over the summer the voucher scheme will be available. So free school meals will be available to those vulnerable children, which I think is a real positive. So things are coming down. I think schools are looking at how that can be costed. I will just make reference to one area. So Olive Academy, our alternative provider, will be getting an additional £750 for their Year 11 students, because clearly transition is a real challenge. So those transition years, so our Year 6s going into Year 7, our Year 11s going into college. So there is money coming in particularly for our very vulnerable students in Olive Academy. And I have to say, Olive Academy have provided weekly updates. They are dealing with some of our most vulnerable children. They've provided weekly updates. They've delivered food, a bit like Joe was saying earlier. They've delivered food. They've got online offers around education. They're getting their most vulnerable back in. So I think, you know, a really positive story, and there is money coming through.
Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Michelle, for your report, and can I thank all members of staff and Joe as well, all members of staff on your team, for all the hard work that I know has been going on during lockdown to continue a service for vulnerable children and for key worker children, and with all the plans to reopen schools in September. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our key workers. It's not just the health service, although we are obviously hugely thankful to them as well, but all of our key workers that have worked so hard to keep things as normal as possible and to keep on top of the most important issues during this time. We're really thankful for that. I think you're right, Michelle, when you say that the challenge is going to come in September, and this is something that I'm incredibly worried about, particularly as it seems fairly inevitable that we're going to have a second wave. One of my worries is that perhaps if we have to go into local lockdown in September, we're going to have kids going through school with another disrupted year. Schools have to close again. I mean, obviously, it's very hard to predict from here what's going to happen. But can you, first of all, reassure us that plans are in place for if we have to go into lockdown again in September, what plans are in place to make sure that kids aren't falling even further behind? I'm particularly worried about what people are calling the corona class of 2020. So those cohort of children that are leaving education and going out into the world, trying to find work, where they're going to be severely disadvantaged by the economic conditions that we're probably going to face at that time. And the other thing that I just wanted to touch on, that we've obviously very rightly been talking about a lot of our very most vulnerable children, and obviously it was right to prioritise their care and their safety, and for funds to come for them. But there's also children who are disadvantaged, and there's already an attainment gap between those children that are receiving free school meals and other children. I know in Thurrock we've done quite well of getting that down to sort of around about 7%, I think, from 11, which is well under the national average. But the research that's coming through from the government is saying that, you know, we could lose a whole decade of attainment in that area. So basically all the success that we've had since 2011 to narrow that gap is likely to be undone by school closures because of COVID. So I wondered, could you sort of say a bit about what the plan is to catch up and make sure that we're not going to have an attainment gap? I mean, the range, I think the median is going to be that it will go to about 36%, but the range that's being predicted, it could be anywhere between sort of 11%, maybe up to 75%. So I think this is sort of a really key area that we need to look at really carefully and try and mitigate the effects that COVID's going to have on disadvantaged pupils. Thank you. Sorry, it's more than one question. I apologise. But if you could say more on that would be great.
Cool. No problem. Thank you very much for the question. So if we talk about what's going to happen in September, I think you articulated it very well. It's very difficult to predict anything that's going to happen in September. However, what I would say is that schools have adapted really well to the online offer. So there is a strong online offer now. There's quite a blended offer available. So I think schools will look at that more closely, look at ways in which they can utilise that in different ways. So I think that will do some of that. You talked about this narrowing the gap, which actually I totally and utterly understand. I think what has been announced is there's going to be money for some tutors to come in and help children and young people during the autumn term. That will actually provide some additional support, additional capacity to try and, bring that sort of ensure that we don't get that wider gap. So that's what's going on there. I think that the bit that you articulate around young people that are just leaving education, whether that be young people who would have perhaps gone off to university or to higher level apprenticeships, or whether that's young people going from year 11 to year 12, is a key area of focus for us. And I think that's one of the reasons that Councillor Howden has set up his economic and vulnerability group, recognising that it's focusing on vulnerabilities, but the lessons and the key actions that we take from there, we're hoping will work on that wider cohort of children, of young people. So that's where we are. I think we've got some strong plans for September about how we can support some of those learners. Clearly, as Councillor Howden talked about earlier, we've got our Inspire integrated youth offer, which will be looking at picking up young people that perhaps haven't gone into the destinations that they thought they were going into. And clearly, we know, colleagues, that apprenticeships are a real challenge. So we know the most recent data that I've got is that we're probably down somewhere in the region of 70%. That's huge in relation to apprenticeships. Now, what we're hoping is, and what business are telling us, which I think, hopefully there's some positive there, is that they're hoping that, perhaps by January time, some of that might have picked up. So, of course, the key thing there is how do we hold these young people for that period of time? Because what we do know is the longer they're out, the more difficult it is to re-engage. And that's actually not just true of young people, that's true of adults. The longer you're not involved in something, the more difficult it is to re-engage. So there are a number of plans in place, Councillor, and I'm more than happy, actually, Chair, to bring something back sort of in the autumn term, just to see how that's progressing, if committee would like that.
Yes, certainly. So you can bring something back. And I was also wondering if you are able to do a briefing note even before then, because I'm sure the schools would do the risk assessment before children are let back into school. We want to be satisfied that things are in place before September. So if you could do a briefing note for the committee, then you also bring something back from October. Well, I've got some hands raised up for questions. I have Nicola first, then Lucy after. Sorry, is that Lucy? Sally, I'm very sorry. I don't know why I changed your name. Please forgive me. Yeah. So Nicola.
Thank you. It was kind of picking up what Sally said, and Joe and Michelle, you've all kind of touched it. Sally referring to the more online gaming of the youths, and you said about the teachers now, but I'm thinking of the year sixes that are leaving school. They're going to a brand new school, and in my son's case, he's going to a brand new school. He's going to the Allsett Heath Academy, so nobody knows them. So how it's okay, like the teachers will know the change of attitude and the behaviour for certain years, but especially the year sixes and the year 11s, they are going to be lost. So it's just really just to give me a little bit more of an insight to that, if I may. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Most schools are looking to have an online tour of the facilities. Now, of course, it's quite challenging because that's a very new school, so they're in construction, as you all know. It will be ready, so it will be ready. So I can give you confidence on that. It will be ready. So I think that is difficult. I think what many of the schools are doing is they're at least trying to get in touch. So when I've been excellent, so I'm glad you're saying that. They're trying to keep in touch. Many schools have done an online tour. So they've had some of their young people walking around with a camera, and they've put it on their systems for children to have a look at. But there's no doubt that it's a real challenge. You know, as I say, I can't sit here and say it isn't, because it genuinely is. But I think schools, again, are trying to be as creative as they possibly can to enable those year 6, 7 transfers to at least get an idea of, you know, what it's going to be like and how it's going to be. So, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely recognise that. And I think schools recognise that, and they're trying really hard to see different ways in which that can be addressed. I'm very glad to hear they've been in touch. Excellent, that's really good to hear. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my concerns are for the year 11s that obviously had to leave prematurely, and if they don't obtain the grades they were hoping to, what provisions have we got in place to try and encourage those students to retake the GCSEs or their A-levels to get the grades they would have got? Because at the moment it might feel quite raw and they don't want to, but we need to ensure that they know moving forwards, if they didn't get the 4 or the 5 GCSE in English and maths, that is going to cause potentially a problem, even with getting apprenticeship, even with the functional skills. What provisions are in place to have that education, that we can make sure that there is that provision to support them moving forward? Because obviously the schools will now have a new cohort of year 11s that they are focusing on.
Yeah, really good question, actually. So what we're looking at, what schools are looking at, is whether or not there'll be some opportunity to resit some of those, or to actually, it's not a resit, is it? It's actually to undertake the exam, not just on teacher assessment. So that's one thing. We're working really hard with the colleges. So one of the things we do, we work is with our local colleges to look at what they can offer if young people feel that actually they feel that the grade wasn't where they thought it would be. And it's a real challenge, this one, isn't it? Because for some young people, it will probably be a grade they think, oh, actually, that was better than I thought it might have been. But for others, it will be a disappointment. And we recognise that. I think it's about getting over the summer, looking at where they're going next, and then what's available in their next place of education that can enable them to undertake those exams if that's what they'd like to do.
Sorry, would there be some financial support though? Because if you're expecting a child to travel to college, obviously they're going to incur further costs, which at this time with the downturn of economy, they may not be able to afford. So they're going to be, you know, that social mobility is going to widen because they're going to be more disadvantaged than going to their local school if the school aren't able to support them. That's what my concern is. We're going to have a group of individuals that haven't got the grades that they need to get it to where the employment they require, but you know, how are they going to have the money to get to college if they weren't ever planning that, and if the family aren't able to support them doing that?
I think in many respects that needs to be looked at an individual level, doesn't it? It's very difficult to make that judgment because we don't know what that looks like. What I would say is our commitment is to ensure that, you know, our young people can access the educational opportunities that they wish to access. So, we will be looking very closely at how that can be achieved. So to give committee reassurance, clearly the work with the local colleges, looking at whether or not there is another opportunity to take the exam if that's what they wish. I think colleges have recognised that some of this is going to be a challenge given what we're facing, so they're adjusting how they're working as well. So I think the whole system is looking at it. So again, I'm happy to bring something back in the autumn term to give some reassurance to committee that that's been looked at.
Thank you very much. If there's no further, Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Misha. Yeah, I just wanted to come back on, you've made quite a few references to the online offer that schools have been offering their pupils. And I mean, I must say, from my own experience, I've got a son in year 9, it's just been a case of homework being set on Show My Homework. We've had one call from a teacher during the whole of lockdown, and really, I mean, it's good that homework's still being set, but there's been no feedback on that homework. There's no chance for a proper explanation, and there's no kind of scaffolding of learning, which are all sort of key essential things that we need for teaching and learning to be effective. So we have just had something through that they're setting up Google Classroom, which is good and very welcome, but that hasn't started yet. I think the first event's actually happening on Friday. So really, I mean, certainly, I don't know if our experience is representative of schools across the borough, but certainly in our experience there hasn't really been an online offer aside from the setting of homework on Show My Homework. Because my son's in grammar band, he's not affected. Obviously, he wasn't taking his exams this year, and I really feel for that group of students who haven't been able to take their exams this year. But he was supposed to take a statistics exam this year, which has obviously been cancelled. So there has been some impact on him in that way. So I suppose I'm trying to get a feel of how representative has our experience been, because certainly I didn't feel that the online offer of just setting of homework was enough to make up for the lost school time. And obviously we've been encouraging him to do other work and do some homeschooling, and obviously the BBC bite-sized lessons have actually been quite good and a bit of a lifesaver in that way. But can you talk a bit more about the online offer, because hopefully we're not representative of the online offer, which was extremely limited in our case.
I'm happy to take that, and then I notice there's other colleagues in the room. I think my view is that's not representative. My view is that when I've spoken to schools, there's the online offer has been very strong. What I would say is that, and again, clearly it's not appropriate to discuss that within this meeting, but what I often say to people is if there are challenges, then go back to the schools. They're always, welcome. They'll always speak to you. So if you don't feel that it's doing what it needed to do, then I think, clearly the opportunity to go back to the school. But I have to say, I've looked at some of what the schools are providing, and it's a very strong online offer. So, I mean, I don't know, I've got other colleagues in the room that might want to come in at this.
Sorry, Councillor, I'm sorry to hear that, but I can assure you that's not going across all senior schools, definitely in Thurrock, in my experience. I've got a child with an EHCP, but we've got applications to go through, and I've got a child in gifted and talented, and we've had pre-recorded Zoom lessons, extensive feedback on Show My Homework. We get a weekly SEN phone call from the SENCO. Every 2 to 3 weeks I get a phone call from my other child who's in gifted and talented.
lots and lots of interaction, Facebook Live from the principal every day to speak to the parents. So I'm sorry that you're not happy with your situation, but I can assure you that that's not happening across the schools in Thurrock.
Thank you. As much as I would like everybody to speak, I'm being conscious of the time, and we still got agenda items. But if it's pressing issue, please don't hesitate to speak. But if it is something that we can find out information other way, then we move on to the next agenda item. Councillor Rigby, West. Okay, Councillor Rigby.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, it's just moving on to the online teaching, moving on mainly from what Councillor Maldoni was saying. During this breakdown, there's been quite a lot of reports on the disparity, the difference between the private and the state schools with the online learning. A lot of the private schools have been doing full broadcasting of lessons, and I just wondered whether that is something that is being rolled out into the state sector, and especially across Thurrock, especially now with laptops being given out to deprived families. Hopefully all families can have a laptop. Whether there can be better organised setup of broadcasting of actual lessons, if that's something that could happen.
Just to advise committee that not all families will get a laptop. They were identified for the most vulnerable, so I looked after cohort of children and young people. I think the online offer, whilst I appreciate, as I say, I can't comment on what private schools are doing, but as far as I'm aware, and certainly I've seen some of the offer, the online offer has got quite a rich base to it. They are using Google Classrooms and a range of other platforms. So I think to give committee reassurance that, you know, schools are working really hard to ensure that they can provide that online offer.
Youth Cabinet.
Thank you.
Alicia, quickly.
Sorry, we was expecting not to get a chance. I've been lucky, well, lucky isn't the right word, to attend school during this pandemic in the provision on that's given. I just have a quick question for Michelle. The government has kind of ignored the post-16 kind of what's going to happen in September. Is Thurrock committing to help those post-16 to kind of get back into education and ensure that things are in place so that they can sit exams or assessments or whatnot come next year?
So to give reassurance, Thurrock is fortunate in as much as it's got its integrated youth offer, which is Inspire, which has got all of our, personal advisors who are working really hard around post-16 to ensure that we have got an offer, and it picks up a little bit of what I said earlier. We recognise that picking up these young people at an early stage is going to be absolutely critical. I think it'd be really helpful if we think about that in terms of the Youth Cabinet. And I wonder if one of the things is I'd quite like to come and talk to you about some of those things that we're looking to do, and then you can give me some feedback.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Michelle, for the updates. So I move on to agenda item 6. Making a noise. Kate, please. Okay, agenda item 9, that is update on Thurrock Children's Services Continuous Development Plan. and that can be found on page 21 to 50. Can I ask Joe to introduce this report? And we are pressed with time because I realize that there's a lot of, more items that we need to go through. So if you could give a brief introduction to the report, and then we move straight to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, this is around the continuous development plan for children's social care and early health. This is a brief update from the update that Sheila Murphy, at that time was the Assistant Director, provided on the 4th of February, and she shared the overarching plan and requested comments from the committee at that point by the 5th of March. What you'll see attached in your papers is the most up-to-date development plan that we have. I will say that it is fluid, because obviously things are moving ahead all of the time, so that it is reviewed on a regular basis. And just to touch back on the development board, I think the question was asked to Councillor Holden at that point, is that the frequency of the development board has now moved from bi-monthly to monthly, and what we have is the three next development boards are really focusing on the recommendations from Ofsted to make sure that we are pushing ahead with them plans. So I just wanted to provide that reassurance to the committee in respect to that. I think we are making progress, which I've outlined in my report. There's still progress to be made, but I think that when you look at the overarching report, it's our aspirations to be the best that we can be, and I think that's what we're looking for the report. And you can see with the plan, we're moving forward in respect to that plan. And I think our big sort of aspirations around doing some collaborative work around our transitions piece of work, because that's where we need to make further progress.
So, can I open it up to question? Councillor Anderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again, Joe, for introducing the report. On page 32.3.3, I think that's a particularly important point, because it refers to children at risk of sexual exploitation, and in the progress box, it mentions a new tracking system is being developed and awaiting implementation due in April. I presume that's referring to April this year, and if so, was that implemented?
I'm glad to say it was, and the meeting is, because I think when we're looking at the system around child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, it's around the system changes, which is outlined in the report, but also the practice changes. So I can say that there have been a number of practice changes, and we have made progress since the Ofsted recommendation. The tracker meeting has been beneficial, because it's really making sure we're getting the risk assessments right, we make sure we've got the right plans, and we've got that scrutiny on the management of them plans. And I think along with the changes we've made around the data, I think we have moved forward. I feel very optimistic around the progress we are making, and we need to continue to make.
Are there any more questions from any member? Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much for providing the refreshed development plan. It's very useful to see what progress has been made. Obviously, you've been impacted by COVID on some of these issues, and I do understand that there's been some slippage in timescales in some areas. But it's really good to see from the plan that there's definitely a clear commitment to continuous improvement and building on that good rating that you got from Ofsted. So that's all really encouraging. I was going to ask specifically about page 44.2. So obviously some things have been on hold, and it was about the meetings, the safeguarding partnership meetings being on hold pending agreement on remote working. I just wondered what's the issue there, and how close are we to that being resolved now? Thank you.
I'm glad to say we've made progress in that area. I think we were looking about what was virtually, but we have had a number of virtual meetings regarding safeguarding and LSCP as well as part of that. So that has moved on from that. As I said, that it's a continuous plan. Obviously, at the point this is the plan that was updated that we shared with Ofsted in April. So I thought it was appropriate that plan was provided to the committee. But I think as we time go on, the plan will continue to be updated. It's reviewed on a monthly basis. It's obviously looked at in respect to the development board as well. So it is sort of quite fluid and moving continuously. So I can provide assurances that we have moved on that issue.
Is there any more questions? No. Thank you, Joe. I'm just going to ask one question because, and that is on the issue of children at risk of criminal and sexual exploitation, which is a major area that Councillor Anderson have picked that up as well. I'm asking about the return home interviews for those children missing from home and care. I would like to know what level of cooperation do you have from the interviews, and then I also want to ask for the future reporting if you could include some data or some sort of percentage of your performance in that area, because I'm sure that sometimes you don't get cooperation from some children as to their whereabouts, but we do really need this information. So if you could let me know how you get cooperation from them.
Yes, Chair. I think in essence, I'm more than happy to bring in the data the next update so I can give you the specifics. What I can say is that since obviously the return home interviews have moved over into Aspire, we have seen an increase in performance. There's close tracking of that performance. And just to reassure again, in August, our deep dive is on missing children and making sure what we're doing to obtain their views and respond and act on their views, and looking at the trends and analysis around our missing children. So I think that's where in the development board, I think I've referred it to a couple of times, but it is an opportunity where we have a deep dive as well as the overall updates around the development plan, and missing is the next one that's in there for August as well. And we're obviously looking at our UASC that are missing as well. So there's lots of work going on around there, and we have seen improvement around the return home interviews. But maybe when I provide the next update, we can give you some detail and some data.
Now, moving on to the recommendation. Are all members in agreement with the recommendation outlined within the report on page 22? Okay, thank you very much. So now, item 10, agenda item 10. We are always happy to have the Director of Public Health, Ian Wake, here, and he's going to give us, introduce the report of 2019-20 that he produced, and that is the title of it is on serious youth violence and vulnerability, and that you can find on page 51, from page 51, and it's actually a big report to 170. So can I ask Ian Wake to introduce this report, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening. As you say, it's a very large report. I've tried to just pick out some of the bits of data and the key findings in a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll go through now if I can get the technology to work. Can you confirm that you can see that? There should be a slide which says serious youth violence and vulnerability.
So can it be enlarged?
Yeah, is that better? Can I just check you can see that?
Yes, we can. It's fine.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Okay, so as a Director of Public Health, one of my statutory duties is to produce and publish an independent report on the health and well-being of the population. We generally do these as a topic, and the topics we try and pick are ones that we think are of interest to as many different stakeholders across and beyond the council, and are also address a key issue facing our own population in terms of well-being. So last year, after some consultation with colleagues, we decided to look at youth violence and vulnerability. I think over the last 18 months, perhaps less so in the last 6 months, this issue has been in the news. And we know that this is an issue in Thurrock as well. So this evening, I just wanted to go through the scope of the report, just a little bit of data on youth violence. What are the risk factors? What are the causal factors? What works? And then in terms of our own practice, what we're doing well, what's missing and what needs to change. What on earth has violence got to do with public health, you might ask? Well, actually quite a lot. You can use a public health approach to addressing serious youth violence and vulnerability. The definition of a public health approach is on the left-hand side of your screen from the World Health Organization. And the public health approach does a few things. So firstly, it conceptualizes violence as a communicable disease. Now, as a Director of Public Health, I'm rather occupied at the moment with another communicable disease in terms of COVID-19. But you may well ask, well, what on earth has violence got to do with COVID-19? Well, actually, they do have some similarities. So if not addressed, then both will generally spread out from a single case and infect the population around them. So kind of violence begets violence. You can treat both with a series of interventions, and you can control both by inoculating or vaccinating or putting in prevention programs that strengthens resilience and reduces risk. One of the other key things in terms of a public health approach is it's a whole systems approach. So it recognises that not one single agency can tackle this on their own. And generally, single interventions are not going to be effective. The most effective way of addressing serious youth violence is to work in a coordinated whole systems way across a range of different stakeholders. The other element is data and intelligence. And the whole systems public health approach uses data and surveillance intelligence to define what the problem is, what the risk and protective factors are, develop and evaluate interventions, and then scale those up. And I hope in terms of this report, in terms of that four-part process, we've maybe done 1, 2, and 3, and now what we need to do is take it forward. In terms of just a little bit of statistics on violence and crime, the first thing to say is that crime generally, as a trend, if you exclude violence and weapons and robbery, has come down quite significantly. So on the graph on your left is from 2003 up to 2018, all violence other than, all recorded crime other than violence. And you can see actually the rate of Thurrock has fallen faster than other areas in Essex, slight uptick from about 2015. However, the rate of recorded crimes of violence, with or without injury, has kind of done the reverse. So from about 2012, you start to see quite a sharp increase both in Thurrock and in other areas in Essex, and actually in other areas right across the country. Thurrock isn't different in terms of this trend. When we focus down on young people, so this is more recent data of the last 4 years, we see that in Thurrock and in Essex, you see a generally similar pattern. So we see a peak in 2016-17, and then a slight falling off, both at Thurrock and at Essex level. In terms of numbers and in terms of rates, so the graph on the left is violence with injury, and the graph on the right is weapons offences. So Thurrock's in about the middle of the pack compared to other districts and borough councils across Essex in terms of absolute numbers. But because young people aren't uniformly distributed across the county, we've expressed that as a rate as well, which are the dots. So Thurrock actually has the second highest rate of reported violence with injury, where the victim was 10 to 24. And there's, again, the second highest rate of weapons offences. One of the striking things, and this kind of fits with the communicable disease analogy, is that violence isn't uniformly spread across the county. In fact, it's concentrated, thankfully, in only a small number of geographical areas. So we did a huge amount of analysis in terms of wards right across Essex. So this graph here shows wards where there were 2 or more reported incidents of youth serious violence in the last 2 years. What you can see is that of the 665 wards in Essex, only 237 or 35.6% had 1 or more reported incidents in the last year. If we zoom in on that data, so this shows wards with 7 or more incidents. The Thurrock wards are in red. So the ward with the greatest number of reported incidents was Grays Riverside, followed by Stamford Hope West and West Suffolk, Thurrock and South Stifford. But actually, in the wards with the 6 or 16 or more incidents, that only accounted for 2.4% of all wards in Essex. Gang culture again, kind of I think fits the communicable disease model. So this is 2016-17 data, and the little red dots are all the rough address of every known gang nominal in Thurrock in 2016-17. If we fast forward 2 years, you can see again how that culture spreads out and multiplies. And here's the 3 years of data, but expressed in terms of the age of the gang nominals that we know about. So you can see that obviously from 16 to 17, which is the red, through 17, 18 to 18, 19, which is the green, the absolute numbers are going up. But it also looks like the age is starting to become younger as well, which is concerning. Moving on to vulnerabilities, there's a huge amount in the report on this, in terms of what are the risk factors, what are the risk factors for youth violence and gang membership. You can group them into 5 categories: individual, family, school, peer group, and community. A lot in the individual, in the evidence base, which actually quite surprised me. So a range of different things, from previously committing offences to some kind of cognitive behavioural, so high level of daring, aggression, antisocial behaviour, low self-esteem. In terms of family, it tends to be around destructive family and poor family supervision. School, low school attainment, low commitment to school, being excluded from school. Peer group has an impact in terms of having delinquent peers or poor relationships with peers. Community ones maybe less so. About neighbourhood disorganisation, I think a culture of violence within the neighbourhood, and drug use within the neighbourhood. Similar for gang involvement, the evidence on gang involvement, the risk factors isn't quite as strong, but actually quite similar sets of risk factors. Deprivation, and this is interesting, deprivation is usually a really good predictor of a whole range of public health problems, from death rates and mortality to lifestyle factors and all sorts of underlying diseases. But it's actually a very poor predictor of violence. I looked at this in terms of all different types of deprivation indices, and the little blue dots are every ward in Essex, the deprivation levels on the x-axis and the number of reported incidents on the y-axis. And you can see there really is very little relationship. So we then asked, well, what does predict violence? Because those risk factors are associated, but they're not necessarily predictors. It could be that the relationship works the other way around. So again, this is explored in much greater detail in the report, but we came across something called the crime paradox. And the crime paradox says this, that if you go into a young offenders institution, or if you go into a prison and you survey the inmates and you ask about their background and their childhood, you'll find that the vast majority had some level of problems, dysfunction, deprivation in their childhood background. But equally, the vast majority of people who come from a deprived background do not ever go on to commit crime or serious violence. And that's what criminologists call the crime paradox. And there was a really, really interesting piece of longitudinal research called the Peterborough study. What the Peterborough study did was it took a sample of 716 young people, and it followed them from the age of 12 in 2002 right the way through their adolescence into their young adulthood in 2015. And they tried to understand and answer this crime paradox question. What was it in the lives and the backgrounds of young people that went on to commit serious crime that were not in the backgrounds of the young people who didn't? So they didn't actually use violence as an outcome. They used prolific offending. So they defined prolific offending as those young people who'd committed over that time period 100 or more crimes. And again, they found that deprivation was a very poor predictor. But equally, they found that the persistent offenders, those young people that committed 100 or more crimes, of which there were 19, mostly came from deprived backgrounds. So there's the crime paradox there. There's your persistent offenders. Vast majority come from backgrounds of deprivation, but equally the vast majority of young people from deprived backgrounds don't commit crime. And they said, well, what was it? What was the differences in the lives of these persistent offenders? And they found two key causal variables that each had two sub-variables. The first causal variable was they defined as being exposed to a criminogenic environment. What does that mean? And we had two sub-variables. Firstly was young people who spent a lot of unstructured or unsupervised time in city centre or other locations that had what they defined as poor community cohesion or a lack of positive social values, so kind of disorganised neighbourhoods, I guess. And the other was having peers that had an existing propensity or involvements in crime. The second causal variable was what they defined as developing an individual crime propensity. And I had two subcategories. One was low scores on a personal morality inventory, and secondly was low levels of self-control. And if you look at those risk factors that I identified earlier, you can map those quite nicely onto those four causal variables. But what about Thurrock? What are the causal variables? What are the risk factors in terms of our young people? Well, we're really blessed in Thurrock. We have Zantura, which is this amazing linked data set of, I think, 12 different sets of data from different agencies, different stakeholders on children and families. So we did a huge piece of work with Zantura and my team working together to try and work out what were the risk factors for young people getting involved in violent crime in Thurrock. And the outcome measure we used was actually young people who'd entered our youth offending service because they'd already committed a violent crime. And we found 5 risk predictive factors. The first was detachment from education, either temporary or permanent exclusion. The second was drugs, both personal drug use, but actually much more strongly predictive was actually drug use at a neighbourhood level. So where just lots of people in the neighbourhood may be using drugs, which would suggest, I think, this neighbourhood disorganisation. The third was having a previous criminal history or exposure. That was actually the strongest risk factor. So if you'd already committed other crimes, you're much more likely to go on to commit violent crime. The fourth was what we deemed family dysfunction, so some level of family problems within the child's environment. And the final was these individual cognitive or behavioural factors, so things like conduct disorder, poor communication, high levels of daring, troublesome. And again, you can see these 5 Thurrock risk factors, I think, map quite nicely onto the causal variables of the Peterborough study. So what should we do about it? We did, again, an enormous piece of research looking at just about every bit of published evidence we could find on what works. And you can group interventions into 4 categories. Universal, so those that everybody gets, so this idea of kind of inoculating the community against violence. Selective, so these are interventions that maybe only some populations or some communities get if they have existing risk factors. Targeted, these are interventions targeted very much at individuals that are already showing risk factors or behaviours that we think put them at risk of committing serious violent crime or gang membership. And then finally, specialist. So these are interventions when someone's already committed a crime or entered a gang to try and address that behaviour and help them exit. So that's the kind of treatment analogy in terms of communicable disease. And you can group all of the evidence into 8 strategic actions, and here they are. We haven't got time to go through them all, but at high level they are promoting family environments that support healthy development, providing really good quality education early in life, strengthening youth skills, particularly skills in communication, empathy, and problem solving, in conflict resolution, and in emotional intelligence. Evidence around that's largely around kind of classroom and schools-based interventions. Then there's a kind of out-of-school element, so connecting youth to adults and activity that role model positive behaviour. So I guess kind of traditional youth work, youth clubs, activities out of school, and mentoring. I think there's an emerging evidence base that looks quite promising around youth mentoring. There's things you can do around the wider determinants of youth violence, around the built environment, around social media, around drug and alcohol addiction and treatment. And then as you move down the scale to the more enforcement and treatment end, I think there's some really good evidence base around what to do with young people who get involved in violence in terms of minimising harm, or those who've experienced violence in terms of minimising harm. And then at the far end in terms of enforcement, about preventing gang membership and enforcing the law to try and disrupt violent offenders and crime connected with gangs. We did a analysis of what we do well and where the gaps are. So the green is where what we do is evidence-based and is got a really good reach. So interestingly, we're very, very good at the early years stuff. There's again a lot more in the report. Our early years outcomes in Thurrock, I think, are spectacularly good. We're significantly better than England on pretty much every key indicator, and given the level of needs in our population, I think that's a tribute to Michelle Lucas and NHS colleagues in the Brighter Futures programme. And we're very good at the other end, at the enforcement end. I couldn't really find anything that we should be doing that we weren't doing. Where we've got gaps is kind of in the middle. I'll come on to talk about some of those in a minute. So I think the key gaps, the skills agenda around kind of youth skills in the classroom, we don't have enough, and it doesn't reach enough people. I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of the well-being, the schools-based well-being service that we've launched in the last 18 months to really start to bring that online. But I think it is a gap at the moment. Youth work and kind of the mentoring agenda. I think what we've got is of spectacularly good quality. So I think this Aspire service is really inspiring. What they are delivering, I think, is absolutely excellent. But we just don't have enough of it. It doesn't cover enough areas of Thurrock. Things like mentoring, we've got some pilots, but again, not enough young people are benefiting. I think there's some things we can do in terms of the built environment. So we've got lots of strategic work in terms of planning and regen, but I'm not convinced it's linked well enough to our intelligence and our surveillance data on violence. I think social media is a difficult area and a gap. We know that gangs use social media to groom and kind of promote their lifestyle. And the other one that came up time and time again was our UM service. I spoke to lots of people when I was producing this report, and I think that came up more than anything else. So I think there are some gaps in provision. We're not doing everything that's absolutely evidence-based. The offer is very individually focused rather than family-focused. And maybe the major problem is the bar is set too high. There are too many young people waiting too long to get a service, or who just are not ill enough to get a service quickly. Just a few final reflections. So we've got lots of data on this, but it's not integrated enough. I think with Zantura, there's a huge opportunity to build on what we've got to create a predictive model. But there's lots of other data that's not in Zantura in different silos. The police data is the obvious one that we need to link up. And then we need to use that in a much more systematic way to see how we're doing and respond in terms of surveillance. I think there's a general lack of strategic response in using that data, in targeting areas. We know, as I demonstrated earlier, that violence isn't uniformly distributed, but I'm not convinced we're using some of the police and some of the ambulance data in a way that we can really target down on some of the wards with the biggest problems. There's a lack of risk sharing between agencies at an individual child level. So lots of agencies are dealing with a cohort of young people that are at risk of either entering a gang or becoming involved in serious youth violence, but I'm not convinced that they are sharing data in a regular and systematic way between them to create a kind of contextual safeguarding risk-based profile. I think what we are commissioning and what we are delivering is often too far downstream. I don't think Thurrock is any way unusual in any of these things, actually. I think we mirror what the national evidence base suggests as well, but I think too often we wait until the young person has committed a crime and then we intervene. So there's a cohort of young people that are at risk of kind of entering gangs or at risk of getting involved in violence, and we don't intervene early enough with them. There's a term, again, I don't think Thurrock's unique in this, but interventionitis. So we've got oodles of different interventions, I think all of merit, but I'm not sure we've got that whole systems approach quite right yet. So very much focus on individuals and individual treatment focus rather than the kind of wider and broader environment. And so in terms of conclusions and recommendations, there are 33 specific recommendations in the report centred around these 4 areas. So in terms of the surveillance and the data, I think there's an opportunity to integrate the data better, to build on the work we started with Zansure around predictive risk modelling, and to use that intelligence in a more systematic way to target down on geographies. In terms of primary prevention, so try to inoculate the population against violence. I think that there are some gaps which I've highlighted around just expanding the reach of our youth service provision around mentoring and around that skills-based offer in schools. And as I say, I think we can build on our wellbeing teams to try and deliver some of that. Quite a bit on the secondary prevention. So this is the cohort of young people that are already showing risk behaviours. So, as I say, better proactive in sharing of intelligence of risk between the agencies to create a risk-based profile and a kind of strengths and assets-based proactive offer. And then around the tertiary prevention, the treatment, I think there are some things that UMS could be doing that are not doing around trauma-focused CBT, a more holistic family-based offer. And we've got a really good service in A&E that I think we need to mainstream. There's a model here at the end just in terms of that secondary prevention that's in your pack. And I'll just leave you with this thought, which was a quote I came across whilst I was producing the report, which I think sums up quite a lot of this stuff and the need to think broader than individuals and about the environment. And I'll happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian, for the very invaluable piece of work you've done and for your presentation. Does anybody want to comment straight away? Councillor Anderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ian, for the work you put into this. It's a really detailed report, and I like the emphasis you put on data. That there's a lot of data in this. The question I had was one of your slides that you showed the addresses of gang members in Thurrock, and if you look, it's areas that are built up, it's urban areas where gang members live, and that tends to be where crime takes place. With that in mind, and given that Thurrock has one of the largest urban areas in Western Europe on its doorstep in London, what are we doing to cooperate with authorities in London when it comes to this work? And the second question I had was with regard to data. One of the recommendations said analysis contained within this report on variation of youth violence at ward level should be used. Is that comparing wards as a whole, or do we go deeper? Because I can think of a couple of wards off the top of my head where there will be a lot of diversity in those when it comes to crime taking. So there'll be areas within the wards where there's a lot of antisocial behaviour, and there'll be areas where there aren't. And so in those wards where it's offset, we might not see areas with high levels of crime come through.
Okay, thank you. Two very good questions. On the first one, I think you raised one of the challenges that Thurrock has in terms of its location. What we know from the evidence base and from local intelligence, particularly around county lines, and I think it's one of the challenges that is not unique to Thurrock, but maybe is a particular issue in Thurrock, is that young people are often moved down county lines into other localities, and so different agencies don't talk to each other. Clearly, our youth offending team has links with both Essex Police and other counties, including the Met. I think we have a challenge with London boroughs placing young people who may already be gang involved into Thurrock, and we need to continue to work with London boroughs to address that and to identify that early. In terms of the data, as with many things, the data will only get you so far. So depending on which data set you look at, whether it's police data or whether it's ambulance data or whether it's youth offending data, and each of those data sets has strengths and weaknesses, you get a slightly different result. But that's kind of why the model on the last slide is very much about moving beyond just the recorded data that may be sitting on a server somewhere, whether that be in the police service, the ambulance service, or in the council, and kind of adding to that with this building of contextual risk at locality level. So what we need to do is to bring a whole range of agencies together to have a conversation regularly to say, who are your 10 or your 20 young people that you are most worried about? What are your concerns, and what can we all do collectively to address those concerns? So we build up a much more detailed and granular kind of locality profile of risk, and we can then use that to do, I think, one of three things. It can drive our strategic response in terms of some of the environment, whether that's police, if we find out there's drug dealing, where there's antisocial behaviour, you can get a response quickly, or maybe a kind of housing team could pick up some of that stuff, or our regeneration planning in terms of trying to change the built environment. We can also, where young people are at high risk, we ensure that they get a statutory response. But for this cohort of young people that are maybe at a lower risk but at some risk, we need to think about what we can learn from other areas of the council, I think, in terms of putting in something that's more strength-based. So something like a local area coordination service, but aimed much more at young people that works with them to try and broker a package of support and to help them to meet their goals.
Thank you. Do we have any other person? Lucia. Lucia, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So thank you for your report. I found that really interesting. I'm part of Thurrock's gang violence prevention team, so your report was really interesting. But when you spoke about the wall, you said patients at Ockenden which had over 7. What sort of measures do you put in place? Because that's a high number with your data.
I'm sorry, I was struggling to hear the question at the end. So you mentioned South Ockenden, and then I missed the last bit of your question.
So on your data, South Ockenden's ward had 7, but obviously that's a high number. What measures are put in place to sort of lower that number?
There's a whole range of measures. As I say, I don't think it's necessarily just one thing that is going to work. So obviously we have a range of programs through the Youth Offending Service that's trying to address gang membership and help people to exit gangs. We have used gang injunctions where there's really good evidence base where we know we've got operatives that are operating. You can go to court and you can put a gang injunction which disrupts their lives in all sorts of ways, from banning them from certain areas to you can take their phones off them, etc., etc. And then I think there's a range of opportunities, provision. There's some built environment things you can maybe do to make it more difficult. So it's that whole systems approach. There's no easy solution to try and get young people to exit gangs once they are gang involved. I think a better solution is to try and prevent them from getting to that point in the first place. And the recommendations, again, a whole systems approach to try and stop young people from actually getting to that point.
Thank you.
Councillor McDowell.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Okay,
thank you very
Alicia.
much.
Do you want to ask the question?
Sorry, is that me or somebody else?
It was Alicia.
Oh, okay.
I just had a quick question. What's being done to protect children and young people from getting involved in crime during the time when they haven't been in education? Because obviously, if they're not seeing teachers and being forced to go into education every day, there's a higher chance of them getting involved in crime and violence. So what's kind of being done to eliminate that?
I'm not sure that we've got evidence that that's true, so I'm not sure I accept the premise of your question that just because a young person is not in education that they're more likely to commit a crime. Clearly, having a structure in terms of education is going to be beneficial to a whole range of young people for a whole range of reasons. So I think the main thing we need to do is to try and get schools reopened and get young children back into, or get all children back into education. And obviously we're working very closely with the schools at the moment to try and support that happening. In terms of broader services, throughout COVID, we are trying to balance two very difficult competing risks. And I'm not sure I have a perfect solution. I'm not sure anyone has a perfect solution to this. One is the direct risk of COVID to the population, and the other is the risk of lockdown, as you're kind of highlighting. And we have to find a way of trying to open as much as possible while still protecting the population and arresting the transmission of the disease. And there are some very difficult balances to be had, but I'm not sure there's a series of things that we can do that neatly answer your question. The main one is to try and find a way to get those generic support services back open.
Councillor McDowell, you want to answer this question?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Ian, for this report. I always enjoy your reports. I'm a bit of a lover of data, and they're always excellent evidence-based reports. I really welcome this report on serious youth violence and vulnerability. I mean, I can see from my own area the ages of some of the children that are involved in the gang culture and county lines are so young that I really welcome this approach from a public health perspective, and obviously the promotion of a whole systems response to that. I just wondered, obviously, I mean, I don't think, sort of from the data that I've seen, necessarily that crime has gone up. I think it's probably fallen during lockdown. But I just wondered, what do you see as the sort of most likely impacts of COVID? Presumably there's an economic one coming down the line. That seems very obvious. But are there other impacts of COVID specifically on this issue that you would see are upcoming challenges?
It's hard to know because we're still in the middle of this. There's obviously a data lag for most of these data sets, so I'm not sure I've got any hard data. My understanding from the national data is that actually a lot of crime has fallen because obviously when you lock the entire population down, it's more difficult for young people or older people, for that matter, to commit crime. More people are at home. They're more noticeable if they are on the street and disobeying lockdown. So I don't have any hard data in terms of Thurrock on the impact of lockdown and crime. If you go back to the 8 strategic actions, then there's obviously a risk because a lot of the key services that would be delivering those strategic actions have been scaled back or are being delivered in a different way. So Michelle quite rightly highlighted earlier the impact of early years. One of the things I'm very, very worried about in terms of schools closing and early years closing is the, I think you mentioned it yourself earlier, that the class of COVID. So we need to find a way to get schools open and early years provision open to address those inequalities and to prevent these risk factors. Similarly, the youth skills agenda and the youth work agenda, it's much harder to deliver those when you've got lockdown restrictions in place. But perhaps on the other end, the enforcement end, it may have had a bit of a positive effect. We'll have to wait and see.
Thank you, Ian. It's 9:15 p.m. I would like to move a motion without notice to suspend Council Procedure Rule 11.1 to allow the meeting to continue beyond the 2.5-hour limit. Do we agree to that? We have important other agenda items to cover. Thank you very much. Thank you. And if I could ask people to, if you have to ask questions, and also the responses to be as quick as possible so we can get through the agenda. Do we have any other questions for Ian? So then I can actually ask my question then. Ian, thank you again. And I quite like the quote by Alexandra Den Heyer. I've checked the surname. It's probably need to check the surname, the spelling. And I also like the analogy of your report of looking at it as a communicable disease is quite apt. Thank you very much for that. Your report is so detailed and it makes it easier for us and for the staff and the workers in support of children in our borough to understand the potential causes of serious youth violence and vulnerability, and knowing why youth could become violent and vulnerable will actually lead us to finding the correct cure in Thurrock. As clearly from your presentation and is depicted in the figure 10.3 on page 153, your recommendation of a locality-based multidisciplinary panel is a good one, which, if I'm correct, this will bring a whole range of professionals together so that they can respond to the identify risk and all the recommendations. So saying this, can we request that a progress on the implementation of relevant recommendation be brought back to children overview and scrutiny? And perhaps at this point, I could just ask the Director of Children's Social Care, Sheila Murphy, if she wants to make any statement regarding this request. Thank you.
Yes, Chair, I think it's a very good request and we should be bringing back to the committee to actually see progress against the recommendations. It's such a comprehensive and excellent report. What we don't want is for it to be put on a shelf and nobody to be looking at it again. It needs to be live. And I think if we bring it back, and then maybe each time we take some of the recommendations and we report back, then that way the committee will know that we're following through on the actions of this very thorough and excellent report.
Thank you very much. The actual, that could be taken as a recommendation on page 51. And we have two recommendations there. And I think the 1.2 is actually bordering on the request that we bring this back, the progress of the implementation back to this committee. So if we look at page 51, we have the recommendation there. Are members in agreement with those recommendations, 1.1 and 1.2? Thank you very much to everybody. So I move swiftly now to item 11, which is the Thurrock Council Home to School Travel and Transport Policy. And that can be found on page 171 to 182. And can I ask Temi Fayemi to introduce the report? Thank you.
Temi, you're on mute. Can you unmute, please?
Apologies. Yes, this is a report that's around a recommendation to refresh the 2016 homeschool transport and travel policy. We have looked at making sure that we're aligned with Department for Education guidance in terms of making sure that the policy is current in terms of legislation, that we looked at clarity in terms of removing language or aspects of the policy that were no longer aligned, for instance, concessionary transport or faith transport. In doing that, there were three areas that we needed to review specifically. We consulted on those three areas. They're around temporary accommodation, where we have families that have been placed in temporary accommodation for a period of over 3 months, and we would transport the child, if they're over distance, back to their local school. We also looked at post-16 special needs transport. We also looked at mileage and the issue of where parental preference comes into play, where the child may not be attending the nearest school, and whether or not we need to align our policy or our practice with DFE guidance that has specific distance criteria according to the age of children. So we've looked at those three areas. We consulted. We did consider that in the decision-making process. So to ensure that we're not window dressing, definitely you would see in the consultation summary, which is attached as an appendix, that the views of the participants weren't necessarily in favor. We did look at that. It does inform our decision. It doesn't necessarily mean that we would have accepted that, but it does, for instance, looking at the mileage issue, where a lot of participants had said that special needs children have to travel further. But then what they wouldn't, we cannot include every aspect of the information in the consultation, but that particular provision would not apply to special needs children for that very reason, that we only have 2 special schools in the borough. So there are certain factors that people may not have been aware of. Temporary accommodation, we did say that for more than 3 months, but we do find that the majority of our families, we're working very closely with the temporary accommodation team. We've been doing that for about a year now. So we do find that because of the length of time that families are spending in temporary accommodation, there are the impacts of the timing. We've spoken to quite a few parents and how long it's taking them to get back to their local schools. And we have had families that had actually asked that they'd prefer to move school to where they are. So there are certain factors. With the post-16 option, it needs to be made very clear that it is not a blanket provision. When we decommissioned post-16 transport for mainstream young people, it was a blanket provision with exceptional circumstances provision in place. If a family had issues around finances, we would support a mainstream child. However, with post-16 SEND, it's not that we would charge everyone, we would assess. And there are some children that have complex needs. For instance, it does sometimes take a young person with special needs or disability a longer period to complete their course. So they might be in education right from the time they leave secondary up until the age of 25. So that would have to be factored in terms of whether or not we would charge. Would we charge for all of the transport, or would we take a contribution? So there are a range of issues that need to come into play. And finally, I'd like to say that we conducted an equality impact assessment to look at the issues that were raised in the consultation. Again, saying that it wasn't just doing the consultation because the DFE recommends that we do it, but also to gain from it, to look into the issues. So we considered the two major issues and the areas where there would be heavy impact, which would have been around those of low income and the families with children and young people with disability. So we've actually gone through and we've looked at those issues and we've addressed, and also within the summary, I also looked at some of the barriers and addressed how we would overcome those barriers, like support that we'd put in for families of post-16 children. And also the benefit, I'd like to say, I suppose the post-16 SEND was probably the most contentious issue. And one of the things that we've implemented since looking at this is the travel training options. So we've already been to procurement. We're looking to implement travel training come autumn. Obviously, we're in this period of COVID, so obviously that would have to factor in. But there would be that option as well, that if young people are independent. I think that's more about, that is the main issue. A lot of this, obviously, it does bring in savings. It's not completely about the financial impact, but there is a lot to say about the independence of young people as well. And this is an opportunity where we would offer that alongside the options in terms of how a young person would get to college. So that's the reason why we've bought the report, is to refresh the policy, particularly around those areas that I've mentioned. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Timmy, for the report. I'll open it to questions. I've got Linda.
I think mine is not so much a question, but a statement. Can I just say that as somebody with 40 years experience working in schools, I think as adults we tend to underestimate the emotional impact of children moving schools. And as it said in the response to the survey, the children that are living in temporary accommodation have almost certainly undergone some trauma already. The idea that they move schools and then move schools again when they go into their permanent accommodation actually makes me feel quite physically upset about it, because I think not only does it have an emotional effect, and I've seen that with my own eyes about children moving, but it also affects their academic progress. We seem to think, they can just slot into year 5, it's easy, or year 1, it's easy. It truly isn't. And I can see the financial advantages, but I categorically believe that educationally it's a wrong move. I just had to say that because it has had a physical, emotional effect on me. It's wrong, I think. Sorry.
Thank you, Linda. You're quite right to the opinion you've shared, because obviously coming from you've heard. Is anybody else raising their hand? Councillor McGartney.
Thank you, Chair. And first of all, can I echo completely what Linda said? We know from Royal Society of Arts report in 2013 that moving children midterm actually has quite a devastating effect on their attainment. So it can halve the chance of attaining 5 good GCSEs. There evidence is there to say that I think this is the wrong move. I certainly would not be minded to support recommendation 1.1. These are already disadvantaged children who may have moved school already. The more times children do move school, the bigger the impact on their attainment, final attainment at GCSE. With those moving 3 times, actually down to about 27%, as opposed to 62% of children getting those 5 good grades at GCSE who didn't move schools mid-term. So I'm absolutely against that recommendation. Recommendation number 2, I'm not in favour of taking away funding for transport for some of our most vulnerable children. We're always being told in full council meetings that the council's financial situation is healthy and we've got good reserves, and I am not minded to support any recommendation that's going to take this service away from some of our most vulnerable children. Recommendation 1.3, I'd just like some clarification because I wasn't clear. There were 2 questions that were asked in the consultation. So there was 2 parts to this. So one of them was about transport would only be provided where parents have applied to the nearest 3 schools to their home address in the case of applications to a primary school place and 6 nearest schools in terms of a secondary school place. And most people agreed with that. But then when we moved on, so that's obviously that is not such an issue for me. I think that might be a recommendation that I could support, but I just need to check that we're not combining the 2 questions. So the second part of that was, if a place later becomes available at a suitable school near to their home address, should the council expect the child to move back to their neighbourhood school and then we'll stop paying for the transport? If this recommendation is if you're looking at combining both of those, again, I would say I'm not in favour. Yes, let's have a sensible process and make sure that kids are going to schools that are as close to them as possible and hopefully don't need transport to be paid for. But if we've got a situation where a child is given a place in a school, but then later on, halfway through the term, a place becomes available in a school closer to them where they wouldn't need transport, again, I think we really need to look at the impact of moving a child within term or within the school year and the impact that has on their attainment. And if it is the case that both of those elements are being put together in recommendation 1.3, I'm not minded to support that either. But maybe there's more clarity on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor McDowell, it's just coming back. Is there anybody else that want to? Councillor Smith, please.
I don't want to go through all the points again. I would just like to echo that I totally support what Councillor Maldoni has just said, and I agree with every point that she said. Thank you.
Any further comment? No?
Chair, may I respond to Councillor Maldoni?
Oh, thank you. I think one of the things that perhaps the report doesn't articulate well enough is that in many respects there will always be exceptional circumstances in relation to some of these recommendations. I think looking at the post-16 one, there is something for me about, and I accept all the vulnerabilities, but there is something about independence for young people, travel training, enabling them to learn those skills that enable them to progress into adulthood. And I think that's really important. And, you know, recognising that committee have got some real concerns around the vulnerabilities. I think for me, looking at that weighing that up chair around independence for these young people so that they're not picked up every day outside their home and dropped to a provision, which actually, colleagues, can't continue through their adult life. They're not going to be picked up every day to go to the shops, to get what they need. So I genuinely, colleagues, I think when it comes to post-16 transport, there will always be exceptions. Always. There will always be some young people that actually we will need to make sure that that's available. So I think just to give committee reassurance that there will always be exceptions there. I think, again, coming back to some of the other ones that have been picked out, so if we look at the temporary accommodation, again, I recognise the challenges of moving children. I mean, I think Linda's articulated it very well with the experience that she's got. And I think, again, that would be looked at very, very closely. This is a principle as such. It's not to say it will happen in every case, but we have aligned this policy to what sort of, other local authorities' policies look like. So it's aligned with that. But again, if committee are not minded for that, then clearly we will take that back, because obviously the next part of this journey is to go to Cabinet. And I think looking at the other recommendation, I think actually we do need to go within legislation. So in a sense, this area about if there's no suitable school placed within the maximum walking distance, we do need to, and we are minded of that, hence the new schools that are coming online, all the work we're doing to make sure, because we recognise that actually it's better for children to go to school in their local community. That's where they build those systems, don't they? You've heard what Ian was saying earlier, that whole systems approach, that's where they build it. So, we are sort of picking up on sort of legislation, really. So I just make those points, colleagues, but clearly committee will have a view about how that needs to be presented to Cabinet.
Thank you very much, everyone that have spoken. With this one, I am, agree with my colleagues that have actually spoken, and I have I've read through all the report, and I quite like the detailed summary of the legal implications in the report, and that was from page 175 to 177, particularly the obligations of the council to consult widely on proposed changes to local policies on school travel arrangements. Also, the consultation exercise was supported with legal advice regarding the council's duties under the Equality Act 2010, hence the impact assessment that was carried out. But looking at the findings from the consultation, it is really difficult for me, and as mentioned by the colleagues, to agree to the suggested recommendations. You carry out this consultation, and majority of respondents are not in agreement with the council's proposal, which forms the recommendation. So if I'll propose that we look at the recommendation again one by one, and because I'm going to be making my statement on individual, because I obviously do need to give reasoning as well for why I'm thinking this way. So if I look at recommendation 1.1 on page 172, although it is the recommendation 1.1 says family in temporary accommodation for more than 3 months will be asked, and whether they want to move or not. But my question is that going to be optional requirement or with no repercussion? So if they refuse to move the children, then they have to pay, and that's how I understand that to be. And then also, will the families be expected to transfer their children and cope with the disruptive outcomes from the effects of instability? And I believe that might stifle the educational progress of these children. So for that recommendation, I'm supporting my colleagues to say that we should not agree to that recommendation. So I know some colleagues haven't spoken regarding this. So I don't know. Should we do it by vote to be sure that we are all agreeing together? So we are against that recommendation 1.1. Is that unanimous or? Yeah. Yes. So that is a unanimous disagreement with that recommendation. Thank you. And the second recommendation, the 1.2, I have concerns also regarding this recommendation to charge post-16 special needs students the cost of transport. It is not right, I say, where it is our own vision in this council to enable vocational and academic education, skills and job opportunities for all. And we would not wish for SEND post-16 students to miss out on opportunity that will enable their potentials being maximized if they cannot afford to attend post-16 facilities and due to travel costs. So for that reason, I believe that we should not agree that recommendation either. So can I have a show of hand what you think about that in terms of like, I think we should not agree that. Is that unanimous? You're abstaining?
I'd like to abstain from that
Okay, so who is agreeing that? Yeah. So we have, no, you are agreeing the recommendation, but sorry, we are, so you are agreeing that recommendation. So you agree that and it's yourself, and Linda is abstaining. But who, if I phrase it a different way, we are against that recommendation. Who is against that recommendation that post-16 children should be charged to go to the education facilities?
Or could that be changed that was means tested, or could that be put a different way, that it's not just across the board?
The problem is, even if that is changed to be means tested, it's going to go into a policy. It's going to go into the refresh policy that they will they will have to pay charges. So that is the problem I have with that. Can I have Tammy? She wants to respond to. I don't know.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I would say that we have a policy in place also, which is similar for families of low income, and the exceptional circumstances as well. And that was why I did mention that it isn't a blanket policy. Even with mainstream post-16, where we decommissioned it, young people can still apply and will be given transport if there is a need. So it's not that we would say that all young people that have special needs are going to be charged. But I know for a fact that obviously I live in the community and I work with children outside of work, that there are young people that have those capabilities. And in some instances, we should be looking at reviewing the level of need of a young person, and maybe supporting them or supporting that family. It's not necessarily a full charge or a contribution. So it's not that, like I said, it's not a blanket policy. And in terms of mean testing, looking at the family circumstances and also the length of time it might take that young person to complete their course, where the course is based. There's a range of factors that we have already identified that we would need to look at before we would consider whether or not we would charge.
I have a problem with your recommendation because you are, whatever you're saying is not reflected in that recommendation. It is not. And if we were to just agree that recommendation and then we leave it, so that means anything can happen. So I am looking at the recommendation in front of us, and we are dealing with this recommendation in front of us. So to reject that recommendation that SEND children going to education facility should be charged for the transport cost.
If it's a case of amending that recommendation, Chair. if we needed to, we can make that clear within the recommendation in terms of the aspects that we would be looking at, and the fact that it is not a blanket provision across all special needs young people or young people with a disability.
Councillor McCann, a question.
I'm just not happy with this being taken away from our most vulnerable children. If we're going to look at cutting sort of service provision, then I don't think we should be starting with our most vulnerable group of children. Okay, it's 16 plus, but I mean, there is a good reason why SEND children may be in education a lot longer. I've got nothing against children being helped, children who have the ability being helped to be more independent, but that's not what I'm being asked to decide on here. I mean, that may be implicit within what you were trying to put forward, but on the face of the recommendation here that I'm voting on, I'm still minded to reject that proposal.
Is it possible for officers to then rewrite the recommendations and send them to us in writing, and we can reply back on the then?
What happened is the program. I mean, the progress for this is going to go into cabinet. So if we have to sort of decide now, I believe, or can I have
Yeah, Chair, if the recommendations aren't agreed, what happens is that, I mean, this is going to Cabinet, so the comments that comes from tonight's meeting will go to Cabinet and the recommendations just won't be agreed, but Cabinet will see the comments that ONS have given.
Yeah, so in that case, I think it's fair enough for us to make to agree or disagree with the recommendation, and then that can go to cabinet, and then the cabinet can then decide on whether they're taking us serious or not on our points. So I will still maintain that recommendation 1.2 is rejected. So how many councillors have agreeing to that we reject 1.2 myself? How many councillors from 3? Does Councillor Akimbon want to say something? I don't know if you're raising up your hand.
Yes, Chair, what I was trying to say was that what about if 1.2 is rewritten, maybe because if she can include that it's not a blanket provision, can that make it okay for you?
As Wendy has given the advice, what happened is whatever our comments, we'll still go with this report to the cabinet, and then the cabinet will take our comments, and it is up to the cabinet to take our comments and review it, or the cabinet will be making that decision. So, like I said, I've got 3 councillors raising hands, and Councillor Rigby as well. So it is agreed within this committee that we reject that 1.2, albeit it's going to go to cabinet, but we reject it. So now move on to the 1.3 recommendation. I actually have a question on that one because I think a colleague also said, because this recommendation is not clear, and I wonder how different is it to 1.1. The concern here is that students who are settled in an educational establishment should not have to keep moving from school to school. That is my concern. And so it's not, I mean, I don't know. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Tammy.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, there are two different aspects. So the mileage, the first part A, is referencing parental preference, where you would choose a school that is not your nearest school. So the Education Act gives us specific mileage depending on the child's age. The second aspect, the part B, is referencing unplaced children. Those are children who were not able to secure a place in their local school, so we're transporting them further afield. Now, the issue with that, and I get the sensitivities that brings, but Thurrock is in a very unique position, and it's brought about by some positivity. The fact that we have attracted a lot of investment, development, housing. So the numbers of children that are moving into the borough, at times it's very difficult to place them in a local school. And I know that we're doing a lot around increasing capacity in local schools, building schools, but that has become an issue. And it's such a large issue that the Department for Education visited Thurrock just to have an idea of the impact of that whole issue around unplaced children. So in other boroughs, it might not have such a huge impact, but I mean, we're sort of between a rock and a hard place because we understand the impact on children and we also understand the financial impact. But because of the numbers of children and the fact that we're doing so much to accommodate children in their local school, if you're looking at a child that was maybe unplaced in year 2, traveling for 4 years. So it's that issue of trying to get that balance. And also, like we've looked, are there times when maybe the other benefits of children being local, particularly around extracurricular activities, friendship, so things like that. And sometimes we have another issue around families being separated. So we have incidents of children with families with up to, say, 3 or 4 children, and some of them are placed in different schools. And maybe you'd have one child unplaced across the borough. So there are other issues which are quite wide-ranging as to why we felt that would be an option. And we are having families that are actually asking that their children come back when there's a place for that very reason, that it is difficult to deal with, extracurricular activities, going to school meetings across the borough. So it's not just because of the financial implications. And again, I must stress that this is an issue that is unique to Thurrock, and it's sort of something that's come out of our being a victim of our success, if I might say.
Have we lost contact with the council chamber?
It seems so. I think I saw it leave the meeting.
Not sure what we do now.
Oh, the virtual world is very interesting, I must say.
Yes.
I went into an interrupt. I'm not sure how. I guess we just have to wait for them.
Yeah.
Have we lost the chamber?
I think so.
It seems so.
Yeah, we have.
Sorry, everyone. Just bear with us, please.
Femi, do you want to respond?
Yes, I'm not sure how much of that you heard, but I was saying that there is a difference between the two categories, Part A and Part B. Part A refers to the DFE requirement that a parent would apply for their local school, and we have parents who prefer a school that's further afield. So that's just saying that you should choose your local school. Part B is more around unplaced children. And I was just mentioning the fact that that has to do with instances where the local schools do not have a place for a child and we transport them to the nearest suitable school. I was just trying to highlight the fact that that is an issue that is unique to Thurrock. We do attend the Eastern Regional Transport Officers Group, and they don't experience the number of unplaced children that we do. And I just highlighted the fact that that is due to the fact that we've attracted a lot of investment and development. So families moving into the borough with children, it's just putting pressure on school places. We're doing a lot around making capacity within existing schools and building new schools. But there is that higher number of unplaced children in the borough. And I mentioned that the Department for Education visited Thurrock just to look into that issue because it is of unprecedented levels in Thurrock. And that's the reason why we're having to look at this. And also there's the family issue where we haven't had resistance from families because families that are moving into the borough with more than one child at times would get one child into the local school and have another one that's having to get into a vehicle and be transported to a different school. And they'd actually prefer for the other child for them to be in the same school, one, and two, because of the issues around extracurricular activities or parents attending meetings. And sometimes there is quite a distance involved. So you might live in Aveley and get a place somewhere further afield, which isn't convenient for the family. So it isn't just the cost. There's a range of issues as to why we were looking at the benefits of a child returning to the school. And I do want to mention, because it's been said several times, even with temporary accommodation, we don't move children midterm. And we prefer to do it at a key stage. In terms of temporary accommodation, like I said, it was just the distance that children are having to travel and the impact of that. We need to look at that as well, because sometimes it is they're not local. A lot of these families are not within the borough. When we're talking about temporary, we've got families quite far afield, and they're taking up to. The DFE does have guidance of 75 minutes travel for secondary school students and 45 minutes for primary school pupils. So there are issues that everybody is raising. I understand those, but there are other factors that do impact children's education and their stability as well, which again, having noted what's been said, if we had that opportunity to maybe bring some of these issues to light to address those recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Temi, for the explanation. It's actually clearer. So, Councillor Downing, do you want to speak briefly, please?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I am mindful of time, but I do want to say that I think that what I take on board what you just said, Temi, but I don't think that removing paid transport services for parents that are in these situations are necessarily the solution to the problems that you've outlined. Parents do have a choice of where to send their children. This policy would force them to choose local. As you say, we have got a problem with unplaced children. So that's no fault of their own. If they can't get a place in the area, then are we still going to pay for the transport? I just think it's. I get that you're saying it's not all about funding, but I don't see how removing transport for on this issue is actually going to solve the problems that we've got and that are highlighted. Surely that's adding an additional burden onto people that they can't actually have to then pay for their transport to other areas.
at that point in time, there would have been a local place. We're not saying we're removing it because of a period of time. At that point in time, there would be a local place available.
Now let's move on to that recommendation 1.3. The way I understand it, sorry, Councillor Smith. Temi, did you get that? Because the basic thing is like...
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Agree that if a child do not get a place locally and the child has to travel, then the cost of travel will be taken care of by the council. But after some time, if the place then become available, so you expect the child to come back to local, even though if a child has settled in the original school. That is the problem that we have. The consultation, there's a part A which almost 75% agree to that because that child should be locally attending school. But if a child has to through for no places in local schools or local area, then the council will pay for the transport. But if things changes, that's where there's issue with this recommendation.
Yes, I think it's difficult for the council from a financial perspective because, like I say, we have to weigh the two aspects and you can't ignore it. And obviously we completely understand the issues that are being raised, but it's how long the council would be able to sustain that. Because like I said, it is an unprecedented number that we're looking at. And I get that that's not really anyone's fault. And we are doing so much to sort of curb the issue and making places available. But then I do feel, again, if you look at the other side of it, it's that issue of stability is for how long. It's likely that that child will spend more time away from their local community and probably siblings than if they were to take that offer sooner and move back to a local school. Because they'll probably also go to a secondary school that's in that catchment area. Whereas if they continue, they'll be in an area where those children are going to be most likely going to a different secondary school. So it does have a longer lasting impact. It's almost as if to say you take the bitter pill now. And like I said, we do appreciate the issues, but we are between a rock and a hard place in terms of balancing those child's needs and the ability to sustain those costs for a long period of time.
I think we have had a lot of talk about this, so it's time for us to just decide whether we are agreeing to this recommendation 1.3 or not. So, Councillor Anderson, you agree that Councillor Smith? We agree to that recommendation. And what about our councillors? Yes,
sorry,
councillors from the remote meeting. How do you feel? I'm taking votes on the agenda 1.3. Sorry, the recommendation 1.3. Are you agreeing to that recommendation or are you rejecting it?
This is Councillor Muldowney. I'm rejecting.
Councillor Rigby, I'm agreeing.
Do we have Councillor Ackerborn?
Abstain.
This can be reported back to the cabinet. I'm also rejecting that 1.3. So it makes 2 councillors rejected that, but that we've got, the reasons and the rejection. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for this report, and thank you, Jamie, for presenting it and for the explanation you've had to give. So the next item is the 12, item 12, which is the SEND inspection outcome. It's written statement of action. It's update of the written statement of action, and that can be found on page 183 to 190. And can I ask Michelle to introduce this report? And obviously, you are minding the time as well, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely, Chair. I'm very minded of the time. Hello, colleagues. Thank you. I'm not going to go through this report. What you'll see here is our improvement journey. So the report I brought in February identified the key areas that we were working on. What I've brought you here is an update of what those key areas were and how we're working on them. But I've also put in an additional column now that looks at impact. So we're trying to build the story of how we're moving our improvement journey to get our services to good and better. I think the key things for me, the key things to bring to committee's attention, I have to say I'm delighted to say that the ICT project is on track, which is really positive because, I've spoken at length about the need to have an integrated system that enables to have a single view of all of the work across education and skills. So that work is on track to be completed by mid-September. And then we move on to the next phase, which is actually having the online EHCP plan that would, again, hopefully make the system more streamlined. I think what I will bring to committee's attention is there has been some challenges around engagement and participation, partly due to COVID, partly due to the fact that the infrastructure group, CAPA, have decided to disband, and that's due to a number of reasons, colleagues. That's that the chair has decided that she's moving on, and the group felt that it was time for them to sort of take a step back. We're doing a lot of support around that, so we're looking at bringing in some one of the national infrastructure organisations to support with the development of another, parent carer forum, because that's critical. How we get that information back is absolutely critical. So we're doing some work around that. I had the pleasure today actually of speaking to some young people about the programmes that they're on. And I have to say, a bit like Joe said earlier, it's one of the really best bits of my job is actually speaking to the young people. And they were so positive. And these are young people that have really struggled with mental health challenges, really struggled with the additional needs that they're facing on a daily basis, really positive about the course that they've been on, which was great, and also looking at where they were going to go next. Now, clearly, that's what committee have picked up earlier, and Youth Cabinet picked up earlier, about how we're going to pick up these young people and support them. And actually, that's where I'm going to, if I may indulge just for 2 minutes, please, Chair, ask Kate, who's been very patient, to just talk about the appendix that you've got here, which is our Preparing for Adulthood sort of strategy plan. So, Kate, I'm going to hand over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, colleagues. I will be very, very short because I'm very conscious of time. You have our plan on a page included in your papers, and that focuses on the 5 main areas that we're looking for in the post-16 SEND. So the first area is focusing on the voice of the young person. So we're absolutely positive that all the work, all the delivery that we're completing with the young people post-16 SEND is exactly what they're looking for, and it matches their needs and aspirations. We're looking at developing a good quality post-16 provision. So we're talking to all our post-16 colleges about quality assurance, about bringing courses that young people will be aspired to progress into. we're looking at quality of our EHC plans. So we've developed a new framework, a new template together with our regional colleagues, and we're implementing trainings for not only our staff, so not only the SAND caseworkers, but also we're bringing in together our social care workers so that everybody has that holistic view of the young person. And also everybody is talking about preparing for adulthood from an early stage. So what we're very ambitious in Thurrock is to make sure that we listen to young people, with SAND, to their aspirations from an early age. So we've started this year from developing and delivering career advice in year 11. In September 2020, we're gearing up to start delivering it from year 9. So we're having those conversations about where you want to be when you're 25, what are your aspirations, introducing perhaps new professions that young people wouldn't have thought of before. And the mantra is you can't beat what you can't see. So we're looking at the different professions that they might go into that they hadn't considered before. And just lastly, we want to increase our young people progressing into apprenticeships and internships, and that's work that will be completing within Thurrock Council and identifying placements for young people with SAND within the local authority. So I'll stop there because I'm very conscious of time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Michelle. Does anybody have a question or comment? Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I must admit that I'm incredibly frustrated by the format that this has come back in. We did request a written update, and the last time this came to committee, we were looking at the document which was RAG rated. First of all, that was in a much better format to be able to see what the areas of concern were and what kind of progress we were making on them. So I'm very disappointed that we haven't seen that document come back updated as I requested at the last meeting, because this is the second update. So we had this document last time. It wasn't properly updated. I think the meeting was in February and there was nothing updated since October the previous year. So I was expecting to see that coming back in that same format so that we could be clear about what progress had been made since then, and indeed what progress had been made since October. We would be able to properly scrutinise it and be able to see where COVID might be impacting things. I mean, obviously we are, I am sympathetic to the COVID situation, and that it may have made difficulties, but I've spent hours trying to marry up this report with the previous document that I see to try and see if we were have we been meeting our deadlines or not. I do take on board that there has been some slippage in deadlines, and you are going to the improvement board you're going to the board to actually negotiate on some of the timescales, which is fine based on the idea that Ofsted will probably be delayed. Sorry about that, it's my cat. But yeah, it was as a member of the Scrutiny Committee, I've spent hours trying to figure out which bit of this related to the document that I had before. It's very difficult for me to say and support recommendation 1.1 to consider the evidence within the report to give a view on whether I believe you're working to address the written statement of action work programme. You may very well be, but because the format of the documents come back in such a different form, with no kind of reference from one document to the other, it's been very frustrating, and I've spent hours on it trying to marry it up, and with some success, but limited success, it must be said. So I'm disappointed that I haven't got a fully updated document in a form that I can really scrutinise, and I would ask for this to come back at the earliest opportunity, properly updated. And on that basis, I will support the recommendations, but I'm really, really unhappy that this has come back again, not updated and not complete. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Madaoni. Does Michelle want to respond?
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm sorry, colleagues, if this is wasn't what you was expecting. My understanding was, and clearly I misunderstood, was that the actual action plan would come back every other meeting, because if colleagues remember, we talked about whether or not we were going to bring the action plan back with a verbal update. We decided on reports, so clearly that's my misunderstanding. So we will ensure that committee get the action plan at the next ONS. Then hopefully you'll have more feedback around where we are in relation to COVID-19. I think just to reassure committee, we have got an improvement board which is chaired by the portfolio holder. So this is being sort of scrutinised or monitored via that route, but clearly it's not what committee wanted this evening. So we need to ensure that it's right for next time.
Can I just follow up on that because it's going to be a standing agenda item, and then quite rightly, as Councillor Madaoni said, it will be helpful if the report is drafted in a tabular form where showing at a glance the impacts and also the performance indicators, so that it will be easy for us to understand. Is that agreeable? So are we, the recommendation on page 184, is that agreed by all? Agreed, thank you. And now moving swiftly, you will be happy that this is an update information, and it's around the free school program, the update of that, and it's on page 191 to 196. Can I ask Sarah Williams to introduce the report?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, colleagues. Just to give you, as Chair has suggested, just an update on the free school programme and where we are to date. As you'll be aware, there are a number of free schools being delivered in Thurrock. We've got the Alsett Heath Academy, Thames Park Academy, Treetops 2 Special School, and we also have a 2-form entry primary school being delivered by the Reach to Academy Trust. And so just a quick update on Alsett Heath first. Their new building is currently under construction, and some of you, if you've sort of been sort of down near to that site, will have seen the construction of that building going up, and it's well underway for being delivered for September. In fact, there will be 120 new pupils going in this September, and a further 120 pupils from next September. The permanent site for the Alsett Heath Academy is located quite close to where the temporary accommodation will be. And although it's temporary accommodation, it's actually a permanent building, but it will just house the pupils on a temporary basis until the new permanent site is built, which is due to be delivered for September 2022 intake. We do have some concerns, and those concerns relate to additional land that is required because the additional land that we need is for reprovisioning of rugby pitches. And so we need additional land in order to mitigate planning. But we are working internally, so internal colleagues, myself and the Department for Education are working in partnership to look at what the options are in order to resolve that issue. And we think that we are making pretty good progress. And we'll have that resolved within the next week or so. So that's Alsett Heath Academy. In terms of Treetops 2 Special School, They are in progress and they will deliver their new permanent site for September 2021. They've already been through planning, and planning permission was agreed back in November last year. In addition to the permanent site, there is a planning application going through for temporary accommodation. What there is on that site at the moment, which has been previously approved at Planning Committee, were temporary demountable units. And with this new application, it will provide 2 classrooms and a sporting facility, which will then, once that, if approved at planning, the 2 temporary demountables, which were given a 2-year approval, will then be removed. And what will be in situ will be a permanent sports hall and 2 classrooms, and the sports hall will then be able to be used by the new permanent site as well. So it will be a shared facility with community use as well with that. Moving on to Thames Park Academy, we have the permanent site, which is going to be located up near Palmer's, so UPS College, and we are about to have a pre-planning consultation on that. But that site is it's not a Thurrock Council site, and that school is due and planned to open ready for September 2022. In the meantime, we have got temporary accommodation, which is nearing completion now. The temporary accommodation is located in Grays and is in fact what was the temporary building for the South Essex College. So it's what we sort of refer to as the blue box behind the college, which is located near to the Beehive. And that building was already pretty well established for taking students. And so we've had to do some minor internal amendments and some works inside the building. The larger part of the works for the accommodation there are the external works, and that's for the secure playground area. Both of those are well on their way to being complete. In fact, the internal works should be completed at the end of this month, with the external playground works ready by the end of August, if not before, depending on weather and progress. But they are both well on track, and actually there will be 120 pupils starting in September this year, with a further 120 pupils next year, before they then relocate to their permanent school once the permanent site is ready and open. And then the last, in fact, it's the area of land is at Hall Road in Aveley. This is still very sort of early stages, and we are expecting a planning application around November time. But before that, a pre-planning application. And we don't yet, there's sort of plan to open in 2022, but we don't yet have a full programme. So, that one I will update again once I know more. I'm happy to take any questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for taking us through this report. At this point, does anybody have a comment or question for Sarah? Councillor Smith.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask what the building at also Heath Academy that's being built now will eventually become once the new building goes up?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Smith. What that will become is a bit of a training centre that will be used by the school and can also be used by the rugby club. So what they are planning to do is use that to train the students, because the school, the academy, is a sport science school. So that's what it will be used for after, so that it will have long-term benefits for the community as well.
Nicola.
I was only going to add on to that. We, as a parent whose child was about to attend Youth Academy, we were told to use it, and then the building will be given to the rugby club, mainly for the use of their facilities.
It will still have use. The school will still have use of that that building after the children move.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, I can see from the report there's some good progress being made. So there's no specific question I want to ask. So are all members in agreement with the recommendation outlined within the report on page 191? Thank you. So thank you very much, and we will now move on to the work program. I'm sure you'll be happy to know that we're not going to sleep here tonight. So we will now move on to the work program. The draft work program is on pages from pages 197 to 200 of the agenda. Does anyone have anything they wish to add to this agenda or amend? Joe.
I was just going to request that the performance report goes on for the next agenda for the 6th of October, and just to update the committee that Alan Cockrove is now retired from his role.
Sorry, Chair, I'm just conscious that the SEND update is not on there, and so that will need to be included on the work programme for October because it comes to every meeting, yeah? Thank you.
I certainly think that we have to consider the length of our meetings and also the number of items that we bring. Because if there's need to be additional meetings, I'm sure people would not mind rather than we sitting through a long meeting and when it may be difficult to add to actually contribute by the time it's late. So we will consider this and bear in mind for subsequent meetings. Can I thank everybody for attending, and I thank everybody at home as well that have been glued to their seat for such a long time. The business of this the meeting this evening for being here, and I now declare the meeting closed at 22:27 p.m. And so I wish you have a good evening, and until soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
It's not. No.
Thank you. Good night.
No. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.